My wife of 40 years packed her designer bags for what she called a deeply spiritual church retreat. She kissed my cheek, told me to make sure I took my daily blood pressure pills, and walked out the front door with a serene smile on her face. She had no idea that I already knew she was heading to a luxury cruise in the Caribbean with a man who was not her husband. And she certainly had no idea that I had already booked 8 premium cabins on that exact same massive ship for her entire fiercely strict and religious family to watch her ultimate downfall. I am Wallace, 74 years old, and a retired chief marine engineer. Before I tell you how I sank my wife and her lover in the middle of the ocean without ever raising my voice, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the deepest betrayals in life do not require screaming matches, but rather cold and calculated consequences. It started on a heavy and rainy Tuesday morning in our home in the quiet suburbs of Atlanta. I was alone in the study, slowly looking through the bottom drawer of Cynthia's heavy oak desk. I was searching for a missing property tax document that we needed for our annual filing. Cynthia was always an extremely organized woman, especially when it came to her church committees and social clubs. Everything had a specific place. Her thick, worn leather Bible rested perfectly centered on the edge of the desk, right next to a stack of sorted mail. As I reached across the desk to move a stack of thick envelopes out of my way, my elbow brushed against the heavy book. The Bible slid off the polished wood and hit the floor with a heavy thud. The thin pages fluttered open against the carpet, and that is when a thick, glossy envelope spilled out from right between the pages of the Book of Proverbs. It was not a church bulletin. It was a pristine, gold-embossed itinerary for Royal Caribbean International. I slowly bent down to pick it up. My thick, calloused hands that had spent decades working around heavy steel and burning hot oil, carefully traced the raised lettering on the cover. I opened the flap of the folder. Inside were 2 beautifully printed VIP boarding passes for a 7-day luxury cruise departing from the port of Miami. The names printed in bold black ink on the thick cardstock hit me harder than a physical blow to the chest. Passenger 1, Cynthia. Passenger 2, Derek. I did not know a Derek. We did not have any family members named Derek, and Cynthia had certainly never mentioned a Derek in any of her endless stories about her church groups. I stood there in the quiet study staring at the letters, feeling a strange, icy numbness creeping up my arms and spreading through my chest. Just then, the wooden floorboards in the hallway creaked. Cynthia walked into the study, holding a delicate ceramic cup of steaming herbal tea. Her eyes instantly locked onto the glossy cruise folder resting in my hands. The color completely drained from her face for a fraction of a second, but 40 years of marriage had taught her exactly how to mask her panic. She recovered almost instantly. She set her teacup down on the side table with a sharp clink, marched straight over to me, and snatched the itinerary right out of my hands. She did not yell or act defensive. Instead, she let out a condescending little sigh, smoothing the paper against her chest as if protecting it from me. "Oh, Wallace," she said, her voice dripping with that fake and overly sweet tone she always used when she wanted to make me feel small. "You really should not go snooping through my personal things. This is just the confidential brochure for the Sisters in Faith retreat. We are doing a guided prayer journey at sea next month to help troubled youth. I need you to stay focused on your arthritis and your heart health while I am gone. Do not worry your tired head about my church business." I looked at her. I really looked at her. My wife of 4 decades. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her clothes were impeccable, and her posture was rigid with self-righteous indignation. She was lying straight to my face, clutching the solid evidence of her infidelity against the very chest where she proudly wore a gold cross every single Sunday. The old Wallace, the man I was 20 years ago, would have demanded answers immediately. He would have raised his voice, slammed his heavy fist on the desk, and demanded to know exactly who Derek was and why he was sharing a cabin with my wife. But a lifetime spent working deep in the belly of massive commercial ships had taught me something crucial about survival. When you are down in the engine room and you spot a critical leak in a high-pressure steam valve, you do not hit it with a hammer. You do not panic and scream. You step back, you silently analyze the entire system, and then you quietly shut off the main power supply. So, I nodded my head. I let my shoulders slump forward, perfectly playing the part of the tired, oblivious, an easily confused old man she believed me to be. "I am sorry, Cynthia," I mumbled, rubbing my knees slowly as if my joints were aching. "I was just looking for the property tax forms for the accountant." "I will leave your church business alone. You know I do not understand all those travel papers anyway." She gave a curt nod, a small smile of absolute victory playing on her lips. Her confidence was fully restored. She slipped the glossy itinerary back into her Bible, picked up her tea, and confidently walked out of the room without looking back. She thought she was so incredibly clever. She thought my age had dulled my mind and that I was too exhausted to notice the world around me. But Cynthia had made a fatal miscalculation. She had forgotten exactly who she was married to. For 40 brutal years, I worked as a chief marine engineer down in the heavy shipyards and offshore rigs. I spent my entire adult life reading highly complex schematics, memorizing thousands of intricate engine parts, and predicting catastrophic mechanical failures long before they ever happened. My brain was permanently wired to retain numbers, identify codes, and recognize hidden patterns. And in those brief 10 seconds that I held that cruise itinerary in my hands, my eyes had automatically scanned and locked onto the alphanumeric booking reference printed at the top right corner of the page. Bravo Charlie, 927 Alpha. It was permanently burned into my memory like a hot weld on solid steel. I stood completely still in the study and waited. 10 minutes later, I heard the sound of her car engine starting and pulling out of the driveway as she headed to her weekly choir practice. The house fell into a heavy and suffocating silence. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a strong cup of black coffee, and sat down at the dining table with my laptop. My hands were perfectly steady. My breathing was slow and measured. I opened the internet browser and went straight to the Royal Caribbean official website. I navigated to the section that allowed guests to manage their bookings. The screen prompted me for 2 pieces of information. I slowly typed in Cynthia's last name. Then I typed in the 6-digit code I had memorized from the paper. Bravo Charlie 927 Alpha. I hit the enter key. The loading icon spun for a few seconds. Then the digital reservation loaded and stared back at me, confirming every single dark suspicion I had and then multiplying it by 1,000. It was not just a regular interior cabin for a church group. Cynthia had booked the owner's suite. It was a massive $15,000 luxury penthouse at sea, complete with a private butler service, exclusive dining access, and a massive wraparound ocean balcony. I scrolled down the page, feeling a cold knot tightening in my stomach as I read the names on the guest list again. Cynthia and Derek. But the sheer betrayal did not stop at the exorbitant price tag. I moved my mouse and clicked on the payment history tab to see exactly how this extravagant and secret trip was being funded. My breath caught in my throat. The website displayed a receipt for the $15,000 payment. The last 4 digits of the credit card used for the transaction matched our joint high-yield retirement savings account. I stared at those 4 numbers until my vision blurred. That was the exact account I had bled and sweated for over 4 decades down in the engine rooms. That was the money I earned while breathing in toxic fumes, working double shifts on holidays, and missing countless family dinners just to ensure we would never be poor again. That account held our emergency medical funds. And most importantly, that was the financial inheritance I had painstakingly built and protected for our only daughter, Keisha. Cynthia was not just cheating on me with a younger man. She was actively financing her illicit romance with the financial legacy I had built for our child. She was casually burning through the money that was meant to protect our family's future, all so she could drink expensive champagne on a private balcony with a stranger. The bright screen of the laptop glowed against my face in the quiet kitchen. I did not shed a single tear. I did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. Instead, a cold and absolute clarity washed over me, freezing any lingering affection I had left for her. The woman I had loved and protected for 40 years was gone. In her place was a selfish parasite who was trying to drain my life's work dry while treating me like a foolish burden. I slowly closed the laptop. The time for asking questions was completely over. I knew exactly what I had to do. I was not going to confront her. I was not going to beg for an explanation or demand a divorce in our living room. I was going to let her pack her bags. I was going to let her walk up the gangway of that massive ship feeling like a queen. And then I was going to legally, financially, and publicly destroy her entire world. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting long shadows across the empty house. Cynthia was gone. She was off preparing for her supposed church retreat while I sat alone at the heavy oak dining table. The glossy cruise itinerary was burned into my mind, but I needed concrete facts. I needed to see the exact extent of the damage before I could formulate any kind of plan. I opened my laptop and stared at the banking portal on the screen. The website was a frustrating maze of passwords and security questions that my 74-year-old eyes struggled to focus on. I had spent my entire life reading complex engine pressure gauges and turbine schematics down in the dark belly of massive cargo ships. I understood heavy machinery and solid steel. I did not understand these modern digital wallets or cloud transfers. So I did what a man of my generation always does when the machines refuse to cooperate. I picked up the telephone and dialed the main branch of our bank directly. The automated voice system kept me on hold for 20 grueling minutes. Smooth jazz music played through the receiver, mocking the storm that was currently brewing inside my chest. Finally, a young customer service representative named Marcus answered the line. His voice was bright and entirely too cheerful for the conversation we were about to have. I gave him my social security number and my security PIN. I asked him to run a complete balance check on the joint high-yield savings account. That specific account was my pride and joy. It was the financial fortress I had built over 40 years of breathing in toxic diesel fumes and sleeping on hard steel bunks out on the open ocean. The line went quiet for a moment as Marcus typed on his keyboard. Then he spoke again, but this time his voice was hesitant and quiet. He told me the current available balance was exactly $2,800. My calloused hand gripped the phone receiver so tightly that my knuckles began to ache. I asked him to slowly repeat the number just to be absolutely sure my aging ears were not deceiving me. $2,800. I closed my eyes and felt the wooden floor drop out from beneath my feet. There was supposed to be exactly $48,000 sitting in that account. $45,000 had simply vanished. It was gone. It had evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a hollow shell of my life savings. Every single dollar in that account represented a piece of my physical health and my youth. Every $1,000 was a missed Christmas with my daughter Keisha. It was a weekend I spent fixing cracked ship hulls in the freezing rain while other men slept in their warm beds. It was a birthday party I could not attend because I was out at sea. I had willingly traded my cartilage and my lungs for that financial security. I had built that emergency fund to ensure that my daughter would have a safety net and that Cynthia would never have to worry about medical bills if my heart finally gave out. And now Cynthia had drained it. She had stolen the blood and sweat of my entire existence to fund a luxury Caribbean vacation with a strange man. I asked Marcus to list the recent transactions. He read off a long series of wire transfers and digital payments to various external accounts. He mentioned the names of financial applications I had never even installed on my phone. Large sums of money had been moving silently in the middle of the night while I slept right next to her. $3,000 here, $5,000 there, $10,000 in one single sweeping transfer just 2 days ago. I thanked the young man for his time and quietly hung up the phone. I logged into my email and printed out the transaction history the bank had just sent me. The old printer whirred and spat out 3 pages of absolute betrayal. I spread the warm papers across the dining table and traced the lines of black ink with my finger. I tried to follow the money trail, but the digital footprint was deliberately confusing. The transfers bounced between different online platforms and hidden external accounts. Cynthia was not a technology genius, but she was incredibly cunning and patient. She had carefully moved the funds in specific increments to avoid triggering the bank fraud alerts. I stared at the numbers until they blurred together into a gray smudge. I realized very quickly that I was out of my depth. I needed help. I needed someone who could untangle this invisible web of digital theft. For a brief moment, I thought about calling my old friend Robert from the shipyard. But Robert was a man of physical action and not numbers. He would simply tell me to confront her or change the locks on the doors. That would only give Cynthia the upper hand and allow her to hide the rest of the money. Then I thought about the men in our church congregation. I immediately dismissed that idea. The church was Cynthia and her family territory. The moment I breathed a single word of this to anyone in our local community, the gossip would spread like a raging wildfire. Cynthia would quickly spin the narrative to protect her pristine image. She would cry in front of the pastor and play the ultimate victim. She would tell everyone that my mind was slipping due to my old age, or that I was being controlling and abusive. I could not trust my own social circle. I was completely isolated in the very community I had helped build with my own hands. I needed a professional. I needed someone who understood the cold and hard truth of mathematics, someone who could follow the money without letting family emotions blind their judgment. I carefully folded the printed bank statements and slid them deep into the inside pocket of my leather jacket. I grabbed my truck keys from the counter and walked out the front door, locking it securely behind me. The drive to downtown Atlanta took almost an hour. The heavy morning traffic gave me plenty of time to think about the man I was going to see. I was driving to the accounting firm of my son-in-law, Todd. When my beautiful daughter, Keisha, first brought Todd home to meet us 5 years ago, Cynthia had thrown a massive and silent fit. She did not like that Keisha was marrying a white man. Cynthia complained constantly to her strictly religious sisters about how it would look to the church elders. She judged Todd on his quiet demeanor and made endless passive-aggressive comments at our family dinners, trying her hardest to make him feel entirely unwelcome in our home. But I never cared about any of that superficial nonsense. I watched how Todd looked at my daughter when nobody else was paying attention. I saw the absolute respect and unwavering devotion in his eyes. I saw a man who worked hard, paid his taxes, and treated Keisha like an absolute queen. Over the years, Todd and I had built a quiet but unbreakable bond of mutual respect. We did not talk much, but we understood each other perfectly. We were both men who would do anything to protect our families. More importantly, Todd was a senior forensic accountant at one of the most prestigious financial firms in the entire city. His entire career was built on tracking down hidden assets, exposing complex corporate fraud, and legally destroying financial criminals. He spent his days hunting down people who thought they were clever enough to hide stolen money. He was exactly the weapon I needed to win this silent war. I parked my old heavy truck outside the towering glass and steel building where Todd worked. The environment felt entirely foreign to me. I was a man of the shipyards, a man of grease and heavy machinery. Walking into that pristine corporate lobby with my worn-out boots and faded jacket, I felt the judging eyes of the security guards on me. But I kept my back perfectly straight and my head held high. I walked to the elevators and rode up to the 30th floor. The receptionist at the front desk looked at me with a polite but questioning smile. I told her my name was Wallace and I needed to see Todd immediately. She made a quick phone call, and within seconds, Todd stepped out from behind the frosted glass doors of his suite. He was wearing a sharp-tailored blue suit with his tie perfectly straight. When he saw me standing there in the lobby, his professional corporate smile completely vanished. He knew I never visited his office during working hours. He knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. Todd quickly ushered me past the rows of busy cubicles and into his private corner office. He closed the heavy wooden door behind us, completely shutting out the noise of the firm. He pointed to a comfortable leather chair and asked me if I was okay. He asked if my heart condition was acting up again. I did not say a single word. I simply reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the folded bank statements, and placed them flat on the center of his spotless glass desk. I looked him dead in the eye and told him, "She is bleeding me dry, Todd." Todd did not ask any useless questions. He did not offer any empty words of comfort or try to defend his mother-in-law. He immediately shifted from being my concerned son-in-law to being the cold and calculating professional investigator I knew him to be. He sat down heavily in his ergonomic chair, turned on his multiple computer monitors, and pulled the papers toward him. He asked me for the secure login credentials to my banking portal. I handed him a small piece of paper with the information. For the next 30 minutes, the only sound in that large office was the rapid and precise clicking of his keyboard and the low hum of the air conditioning unit. I sat back in the leather chair and watched him work. I watched him trace the digital footprint of my treacherous wife. I watched him pull up public tax records, run deep background checks, and trace financial routing numbers across different states. Todd was navigating the invisible world of digital money with the exact same precision I used to navigate the massive engine room of a commercial cargo ship. He was methodically pulling apart every single one of Cynthia's lies piece by piece. Suddenly, the rapid clicking of the keyboard stopped. The silence in the room became incredibly heavy and suffocating. I watched as the color completely drained from Todd's face. His skin turned a pale and sickly shade of gray. He slowly took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes as if he could not believe what he was seeing on the monitor. He looked at the bright screen, and then he looked directly at me. I noticed that his hands were actually trembling against the edge of the glass desk. I asked him what he had found. I told him I could handle the truth. I told him I already knew she stole $45,000 in cash to pay for the luxury cruise with her lover. Todd swallowed hard. He leaned forward and clasped his hands together, resting them on the desk. He spoke in a whisper, telling me the stolen cash was just the beginning of the nightmare. He explained that he had just run a deep credit check and pulled the official municipal property records for my house, the exact same house I had paid off in full over 10 years ago with my own blood and sweat. Todd looked me straight in the eyes and delivered the final fatal blow that would change everything. He told me Cynthia had not just drained the retirement accounts. She had completely forged my signature and bypassed the legal banking protocols to take out a massive second mortgage on our family home. The house was entirely underwater. She had secretly leveraged the very roof over my head to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars in a massive lump sum. I was standing on the absolute edge of total financial ruin, and the woman I had loved and protected for 40 years was the one who happily pushed me over. I sat completely frozen in the leather chair inside the quiet office of my son-in-law. I was staring at the digital reflection of my ruined financial life on his computer screen. The second mortgage was a financial death sentence hanging directly over my head, but Todd did not stop his investigation there. A forensic accountant is trained to follow every single hidden thread until the entire sweater unravels. He told me to stay in the chair and breathe slowly while he dug deeper into the man who was currently destroying my family. I watched my son-in-law type furiously on his mechanical keyboard. His face was a tight mask of pure professional concentration. He accessed restricted public records and ran deep background checks using the single name we had found on the glossy cruise itinerary. Passenger number 2 was named Derek. I sat in heavy silence, remembering the 4 decades I spent down in the dark engine rooms of commercial ships checking the structural integrity of thick steel hulls. I knew exactly how to find a microscopic crack in a massive ship before it sank into the ocean. Todd knew exactly how to find the hidden cracks in a human life. It took him less than 40 minutes to completely reconstruct the existence of the man who was sleeping with my wife. Todd turned his large computer monitor slightly so I could see the bright screen. He pointed his finger to a low-quality driver license photograph of a man who looked to be around 50 years old. The man had a perfectly trimmed dark beard and a confident, arrogant smirk on his face. This was Derek. Todd began to read out loud from the thick digital dossier he had just compiled in record time. Derek was not a successful businessman, he was not a spiritual advisor, and he certainly was not a wealthy retiree. He was a 50-year-old professional parasite. Todd explained to me in a low, steady voice that Derek had a long and highly documented criminal history of targeting older, vulnerable women. He was a serial romance scammer. He purposely found his wealthy victims in suburban church congregations and upscale grocery stores. He would charm them, isolate them from their protective families, and then slowly drain their retirement bank accounts dry. But the most damning piece of information was his current financial status. Todd pulled up a federal tax lien document on the screen. Derek owed the Internal Revenue Service over $200,000 in unpaid back taxes. The federal government was actively hunting him down to collect the massive debt. He had 0 personal assets, 0 legitimate income, and absolutely no future. The realization hit me like a physical blow to my chest. Cynthia was not just throwing away our 40-year marriage for a passionate, late-life romance. She was being entirely played and manipulated by a desperate career criminal who urgently needed her stolen cash to keep the federal government off his back. And my wife, the proud and deeply religious Cynthia, was willingly handing over my blood and sweat to save a worthless stranger. The sheer magnitude of her foolishness was absolutely staggering. I asked Todd to print every single document he had found. I needed the hard evidence in my hands. I folded the thick stack of warm papers and placed them carefully next to my heart inside my heavy jacket. I thanked Todd for his deep loyalty. We agreed to keep my daughter Keisha completely in the dark for now. I needed to handle my treacherous wife personally before the rest of the family got involved. I drove my heavy old truck back to our quiet suburban neighborhood. The evening sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of our street. I parked in the concrete driveway and sat behind the steering wheel for a long time. I looked up at the beautiful 2-story house I had paid for with my lost youth and my failing joints. the very house that Cynthia had secretly mortgaged behind my back to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air and mentally prepared myself for the hardest performance of my entire life. I walked through the heavy wooden front door and immediately smelled the rich aroma of baked chicken and roasted vegetables. Cynthia was standing in the bright kitchen wearing a floral apron over her expensive boutique clothes. She turned around and smiled at me with absolute perfection. It was the radiant smile of a woman who fully believed she had completely won the game. She told me to wash my hands quickly because our dinner was almost ready to be served. I walked to the hallway bathroom and stared at my aging, tired face in the glass mirror. I splashed freezing cold water on my dark skin. I had to bury my burning rage deep down inside my chest where she could not see it. I walked into the formal dining room and sat down at the heavy mahogany table. Cynthia served the hot food and began to chatter happily about her upcoming church retreat. She talked continuously about the deep spiritual healing she was hoping to find on the ocean waves. Every single word coming out of her mouth was a carefully constructed and poisonous lie. I chewed my food slowly and nodded my head gently, playing the pathetic part of the tired old husband she expected me to be. I kept my eyes focused strictly on my ceramic plate so she would not see the absolute disgust burning intensely in my soul. Halfway through the quiet meal, Cynthia stood up and walked over to the wooden cabinet in the corner of the dining room. She opened a top drawer and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She walked back to the table and casually placed a neat stack of formal papers right next to my dinner plate. She handed me a black ink pen with a sweet and incredibly innocent smile. She softly told me it was just some routine life insurance paperwork that the bank needed me to update for their annual records. She claimed the church accountant had personally reviewed it and assured her it was perfectly standard procedure. She lightly tapped her perfectly manicured fingernail on the bottom signature line, telling me to just quickly sign my name so she could mail it out the next morning before she left for her long trip. The old Wallace, the man I used to be, would have blindly trusted her words. For 40 years, my legal signature belonged to her whenever she asked for it to make her life easier, but my eyes were wide open now to her true nature. I picked up the thick document and slowly adjusted my wire reading glasses on the bridge of my nose. I did not look at the bottom signature line where she wanted me to blindly sign away my life. Instead, I used my trained engineering eyes to scan the dense paragraphs of legal text. I looked closely for the hidden variables. I scanned the secondary beneficiary clauses, and there it was. Buried deep on the third page in very small gray print was a permanent amendment to my primary life insurance policy. The exact policy that was legally supposed to pay out $500,000 to my daughter Keisha upon my eventual death. Cynthia was attempting to formally add a secondary beneficiary to the massive financial payout. The name printed clearly in the legal document was Derek. She was trying to legally ensure that if my tired heart finally gave out from the stress, the young scammer sleeping with my wife would receive the money I had earned through a lifetime of brutal physical labor. A freezing cold chill washed over my entire body, settling deep into my bones. Cynthia was not just planning to leave me financially ruined and homeless. She was actively preparing for my actual death. She was setting up a golden financial parachute for her criminal lover, using my life insurance policy as the funding source. She stood over me, tapping her foot impatiently on the hardwood floor. She asked me what was taking so long. She said it was just a simple signature and that my old eyes were probably too tired to read the small fine print anyway. I looked down at the black ink pen resting in my right hand. I looked at the hot ceramic mug of black coffee resting dangerously near my elbow. I desperately needed to destroy that legal document without raising her suspicions about what I actually knew. I began to make my right hand tremble violently on purpose. I let the plastic pen slip right through my shaking fingers and clatter loudly against the wooden table. I let out a soft, painful groan and complained loudly that my severe arthritis was flaring up badly from the cold evening weather. Cynthia sighed loudly and rolled her eyes in pure, unapologetic annoyance. As I reached out my hand to grab the dropped pen again, I intentionally jerked my heavy elbow sideways. My thick arm slammed heavily into the large ceramic mug. The scalding hot black coffee tipped over immediately and spilled completely across the smooth table. A dark tidal wave of hot liquid crashed directly over the life insurance documents, instantly soaking through the thick white paper and blurring the black ink into an illegible, muddy mess. Cynthia let out a sharp and deafening scream that echoed off the dining room walls. She jumped back aggressively as the hot, dark coffee dripped off the edge of the table and splashed onto her expensive designer shoes. She completely lost her sweet and patient church-going facade in a fraction of a second. Her face twisted into a terrifying mask of pure and ugly rage. She slammed her hands violently on the wet table and glared at me with absolute, unhidden hatred. She called me a useless, shaky old fool. She screamed at the top of her lungs that I could not do a single simple thing right anymore. She yelled fiercely that my clumsy old hands were becoming a massive and unbearable burden on her perfect life. She stood there, with her chest heaving, looking down at me as if I was a disgusting piece of garbage that needed to be thrown out immediately. I did not say a single word in my own defense. I simply lowered my head, grabbed a large handful of paper towels from the counter, and began to slowly wipe up the dark mess on the table. I let her scream at me. I let her hurl her bitter and cruel insults at my face. Her harsh words did not hurt me anymore because the angry woman screaming at me was a total stranger. As I wiped the ruined documents, completely destroying the paper fibers entirely, I realized the absolute truth of my dark situation. She was planning to leave me completely destitute to die alone in this empty, mortgaged house while she lived in pure luxury with a professional scammer. She had stripped away every single ounce of my humanity and reduced me to nothing more than a failing bank account to be emptied. I threw the soggy, ruined papers directly into the kitchen trash can. I quietly apologized for my clumsy old hands and told her softly that I would sign fresh copies of the paperwork when she returned from her spiritual church retreat. She glared at me with pure disgust, grabbed her leather purse, and stormed angrily out of the dining room without another word. I stood completely alone in the quiet kitchen, listening to her heavy, angry footsteps climbing the wooden stairs. The silent adjustment had officially begun. I was no longer an old man trying desperately to save his broken marriage. I was a structural engineer preparing to demolish a highly compromised building, and I was going to bring the entire massive structure down directly on her head. The next morning, the house was completely silent. Cynthia had already left for her morning church choir practice, leaving behind the faint smell of her expensive perfume. I stood in the kitchen looking at the empty trash can where I had thrown the ruined life insurance documents the night before. She thought she had me completely cornered. She thought I was just a broken old man who would quietly fade away while she enjoyed the wealth I had built with my bare hands. But she did not understand that a man who has spent his entire life working in the dangerous engine rooms of massive ships knows exactly how to build a trap. I realized that simply canceling her credit cards or locking the bank accounts was not enough. If I confronted her in the privacy of our home, she would simply twist the truth. She would cry and play the victim. She would run to her religious family and tell them I was an abusive and controlling husband who was losing his mind to old age. I needed an audience. I needed the most judgmental, unforgiving audience on the planet to witness her absolute moral failure with their own eyes. And I knew exactly who that audience had to be. I walked out to my old truck and drove past the local bank where my stolen savings account was held. I drove all the way to a different financial institution on the other side of town. Decades ago, before I ever started working in the commercial shipyards, I had served 2 tough tours in the United States Navy. During my service, I had sustained a severe injury to my left shoulder during a massive engine fire. The military had given me a partial disability payout and a veteran pension. I had deposited that money into a completely separate high-yield private account 40 years ago. I never told Cynthia about the full extent of this specific account. I never touched a single dime of it because it was my absolute last resort emergency fund. It was my blood money. Over the decades, the interest had compounded silently, turning that small military payout into a massive and untouchable war chest. I walked into the quiet bank lobby, sat down with a private wealth manager, and asked for full access to my funds. The young man in the tailored suit looked at my worn-out boots and faded jacket with a hint of doubt until he typed my social security number into his computer system. His posture changed immediately when he saw the massive balance. I sat at his polished wooden desk and pulled out a small piece of paper. On it, I had written the exact dates and the specific name of the massive Royal Caribbean ship that Cynthia and her criminal lover Derek were boarding next month. I asked the wealth manager to help me make a very large and highly specific purchase. We spent the next 2 hours on the telephone with the cruise line VIP booking department. I did not just book one room. I used my veteran savings to purchase 8 premium balcony cabins on the exact same sailing. I was meticulously careful about the location of these rooms. I made sure they were located 3 decks below the owner's suite where Cynthia would be staying. I did not want any accidental encounters in the hallways before the trap was perfectly set. I paid for the premium drink packages, the luxury dining options, and the expensive port excursions. I spared absolutely no expense. I wanted this to be the most luxurious and unforgettable vacation her family had ever experienced. The total cost was astronomical, but I did not care. I was buying the heavy nails for her coffin, and I wanted them to be made of solid gold. Once the booking confirmations were printed and securely tucked into my jacket pocket, I drove back to my empty house. It was time to invite the guests to the execution. Cynthia came from a large, fiercely proud, and highly judgmental family. They were the kind of people who wore their expensive Sunday clothes like armor and looked down on anyone who did not meet their strict moral standards. But the true head of the snake was her mother, Matilda. Matilda was 92 years old, and she ruled her local church congregation with an iron fist. She was a terrifying matriarch who demanded absolute perfection from her children. When I first married Cynthia 40 years ago, Matilda had strongly disapproved. She told everyone I was just a dirty shipyard worker who was not good enough for her beautiful and refined daughter. Over the decades, I had silently tolerated her harsh criticism and her condescending attitude to keep the peace in my home. But today, Matilda was going to become my greatest weapon. I sat down at the kitchen table and dialed Matilda's phone number. My heart was beating in a slow and heavy rhythm. I had to play this completely perfectly. A woman like Matilda could smell a lie from a mile away. The phone rang 3 times before she answered. Her voice was sharp and clear despite her advanced age. I greeted her with the utmost respect, calling her mother Matilda, just the way she liked. I told her I was calling with some incredibly wonderful news, but it had to remain an absolute secret. I explained that Cynthia had been working so hard for the church and taking such good care of me in my old age that I wanted to reward her. I told Matilda that since Cynthia was approaching her 70th milestone in a couple of years, I wanted to throw a massive early surprise birthday and family reunion. I paused for a dramatic effect, and then I dropped the bait. I told her I had fully paid for 8 luxury balcony cabins on a Caribbean cruise for her and the entire family. I told her it was my way of thanking them for giving me such a devoted and faithful wife. The silence on the other end of the telephone was incredibly heavy. For the first time in 40 years, Matilda was completely speechless. When she finally spoke, her sharp voice actually trembled with raw emotion. She told me she was overwhelmed. She said she had always been terribly tough on me, but that I was truly a good and righteous man. She started crying soft tears of joy, talking about how beautiful it would be to have the entire family together on the ocean to celebrate her perfect daughter. She began naming the siblings who would come: her brother Thomas, the strict church deacon; her sister Martha, the neighborhood gossip. Everyone who mattered in Cynthia's world was going to be there. I smiled coldly as she listed the names of the jury members. But then my blood suddenly ran completely cold. Matilda sniffled loudly and said she needed to hang up the phone right now. She told me she was going to call Cynthia this very second to thank her and to bless her for marrying such a generous man. Panic flared in my chest like a sudden chemical fire. If Matilda called Cynthia right now, the entire plan would instantly collapse. Cynthia would know I was tracking her. She would cancel her trip with Derek, and she would immediately hire a ruthless divorce lawyer to drain whatever was left of my life. The trap would shatter before it was even set. I gripped the phone tightly and forced my voice to sound gentle and deeply vulnerable. I interrupted her quickly and begged her not to ruin the surprise. I told her that Cynthia had no idea her family was coming. I painted a vivid picture of the grand plan. I told Matilda that Cynthia thought she was just going on a quiet church retreat. I told her the plan was for the entire family to hide on the ship and surprise her at a massive private dinner on the second night of the cruise. I leaned heavily into Matilda's deep religious pride. I told her that if Cynthia knew the family was coming, she would stress herself out trying to be the perfect hostess. I said this was a test of faith and patience. I asked Matilda if she could be the strong, silent keeper of this beautiful secret. I told her that the look of pure shock and joy on her daughter's face when the dining room doors opened would be a memory they would cherish forever. I played her massive ego like a perfectly tuned instrument. Matilda paused for a long, tense moment. I could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking in the background of her house. Finally, she let out a soft, warm laugh. She told me I was a sly old fox. She promised on her beloved family Bible that she would not breathe a single word of this to Cynthia or anyone else until they were safely on the ship. She assured me she would personally command the rest of the family to pack their bags in absolute secrecy. I thanked her deeply and hung up the telephone. My hands were slick with cold sweat. It was the closest I had come to total disaster, but the heavy iron gates of the trap had finally snapped shut. Cynthia was going to walk onto that massive luxury ship thinking she was completely untouchable. She believed she had outsmarted a tired old man and secured a wealthy future with her young criminal lover. She had absolutely no idea that I had just purchased the front row tickets to her total destruction and handed them directly to the very people whose approval she valued more than her own life. The silent adjustment was moving exactly as I had calculated. Now I just had to wait for the day of departure. I drove back to downtown Atlanta the very next morning to meet with my son-in-law. The heavy gray clouds hung low over the city, mirroring the cold storm that was brewing inside my mind. Todd had called me early and told me to come straight to his office because he had brought in a specialist to help us execute the next phase of our plan. When I walked into his private glass conference room, there was an unfamiliar man sitting calmly at the long, polished wooden table. His name was Marcus Sterling. Marcus was a senior corporate litigation attorney and an old college friend of Todd. He wore a sharp, dark charcoal suit, and he had eyes that looked like a hungry wolf calculating its next meal. Todd had already briefed him thoroughly on everything regarding my wife and her stolen money. Marcus did not stand up to shake my hand, and he did not offer any empty, useless sympathies about my broken marriage. I liked him immediately for that. He simply opened a thick leather briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of dense legal documents, placing them squarely on the table. He spoke in absolute facts and brutal legal realities. Marcus explained carefully that because Cynthia had completely forged my signature to secure the massive second mortgage, she had not just made a terrible financial mistake. She had committed a severe federal crime involving bank fraud and wire fraud. But instead of just calling the local police and letting her deny everything with her fake tears, we were going to use her own immense greed to build an inescapable legal trap. Marcus slid a heavy piece of official parchment paper across the smooth table toward me. It was the original master deed to my house. This was the exact same house I had paid off in full, with 40 years of sweat-burning lungs and broken joints down in the heavy commercial shipyards. Marcus explained that since the new second mortgage was obtained through total and complete fraud, the bank technically had a highly compromised claim to the property. However, my original claim as the sole financial breadwinner and the primary name on the initial property title was still absolute and protected by state law. He told me we were going to execute a very specific and ruthless legal maneuver. We were going to legally transfer the absolute ownership of the entire property into an irrevocable trust. This trust would be completely and permanently controlled by my daughter, Keisha. Once I signed these thick papers, I would no longer technically own the house, and neither would Cynthia. Keisha would become the absolute legal owner of the estate. Marcus leaned forward and explained the true beauty of this legal guillotine. When Cynthia eventually ran out of stolen money and stopped paying the fraudulent second mortgage, the bank would naturally try to seize the house. But they would hit a massive, impenetrable legal wall because the property was now fully protected inside the irrevocable trust. And Cynthia would be left completely exposed to the federal fraud charges with absolutely no physical assets to her name to use as leverage or bail money. I picked up the heavy black pen resting next to the documents. I did not hesitate for a single second. I did not feel any lingering sorrow for the woman who was currently packing her bags for a luxury cruise with my money. I signed my name carefully and methodically on every single line Marcus pointed to. I was officially giving away my entire life savings and my beloved home to my daughter just to ensure that my treacherous wife would never see a single penny of it. It felt incredible. It felt exactly like cutting a heavy rusted anchor chain and watching a sinking ship drift away into the dark ocean. Just as Marcus was placing his official heavy notary stamp on the final page of the trust documents, the heavy glass door of the conference room suddenly swung open. Keisha walked in. She was wearing her blue hospital scrubs and looking completely exhausted. She was supposed to be working her long shift at the medical center, but Todd had quietly texted her that morning, telling her it was an absolute family emergency and she needed to come over immediately. When she saw the intense, dark look on our faces and the massive stack of legal papers spread across the table, she stopped dead in her tracks. The plastic coffee cup in her hand trembled slightly. Todd stood up slowly, walked over to his wife, and gently guided her to an empty leather chair. I watched my beautiful and incredibly strong daughter sit down. I took a deep, heavy breath, and I told her absolutely everything. I told her about the missing retirement money that was supposed to be her inheritance. I told her about the forged mortgage that had put her childhood home in massive jeopardy. And finally, I told her the absolute worst truth of all. I told her about Derek, the serial romance scammer, and the $15,000 luxury cruise her mother was taking him on. I watched the absolute shock wash over her face, completely draining her of color. But that shock was followed almost immediately by a massive wave of pure, unadulterated fury. Keisha is a gentle and caring nurse, but she has the fierce, hot blood of a shipyard worker running deep through her veins. She stood up so fast and with so much force that her heavy leather chair crashed backward onto the hardwood floor. She screamed that she was going to drive straight back to our house and drag her mother out into the street by her hair. She wanted to physically tear Cynthia apart with her bare hands for what she had done to me. She started marching aggressively toward the glass door, completely blinded by her raging emotions. Todd and I had to physically jump in front of her to block her path. I grabbed my daughter tightly by her shoulders, holding her back with every single ounce of remaining strength in my old, tired arms. She fought fiercely against me, crying hot, angry tears and begging me to let her go confront that monster. I held her firmly, and I looked deep into her dark eyes. I told her to stop right now. I spoke in a low, heavy rumble and told her that anger makes you loud, but clarity makes you dangerous. I carefully explained the entire grand plan to her. I told her about the secret veteran bank account and the 8 premium cruise cabins I had already purchased. I told her about the massive family surprise I had orchestrated with her extremely strict and judgmental grandmother, Matilda. I painted a vivid and detailed picture of Cynthia standing in the grand dining room of that ship, completely exposed and ruined in front of the very people whose approval she worshipped. I promised Keisha that her mother would face a punishment far worse than any physical confrontation we could give her today. Keisha slowly stopped fighting against my grip. She took a ragged, deep breath and wiped the hot tears from her face. She looked at me with a cold, dark determination that made me incredibly proud. She picked up her fallen chair, sat back down, and agreed to wait patiently for the ocean drop. The emotional storm inside the conference room slowly began to settle into a quiet and deadly focus. We had successfully contained the explosion and brought Keisha into the fold, but Todd was not completely finished yet. He walked over to his desk and turned his bright laptop screen toward the 3 of us. He told us that while Marcus had been busy preparing the heavy trust documents, he had been doing some deep forensic digging into the $45,000 that Cynthia had stolen from my bank account. Todd explained that professional scammers like Derek never hold on to large amounts of liquid cash for very long. They always convert the stolen money into hard physical assets to hide their wealth from the federal tax agencies tracking them. Todd had spent the entire morning tracking the complex wire transfers through 3 different hidden shell accounts. The stolen money had finally landed at a high-end luxury car dealership on the wealthy north side of the city. Todd pulled up a scanned digital sales receipt on his computer screen. Derek had used my hard-earned retirement money to purchase a sleek, customized, imported sports car just 2 days ago. But here was the absolute genius and the terrifying reality of his criminal mind. Derek had bought the expensive vehicle entirely in his own name. He legally owned the sports car free and clear. But because the money was traced directly back to Cynthia, and she was the one who personally authorized the fraudulent digital transfers from our joint savings account, she was the one legally responsible for the massive debt. Todd looked at us and explained the brutal mathematics of the situation. Derek had effectively stolen my money, bought himself a beautiful luxury toy, and left my wife holding the empty financial bag. Because Derek currently owed the Internal Revenue Service hundreds of thousands of dollars in back taxes, the federal government was going to seize that brand new sports car the moment he registered it. Derek would lose the car, but Cynthia would still be completely on the hook for the missing $45,000 she stole from the bank. She was entirely legally liable for a debt she could never possibly repay because we had just locked her only remaining asset inside the irrevocable trust. The realization was absolutely staggering to comprehend. Cynthia truly thought she was brilliantly buying the love and loyalty of a handsome younger man, but in reality she was completely financing his criminal lifestyle and actively destroying her own future in the process. The legal noose was not just tight around her neck now. She had tied the heavy knot entirely by herself, and she had willingly handed the thick rope directly to a professional thief. I looked at the bright computer screen showing the luxury car, and then I looked at my daughter and my brilliant son-in-law. We did not need to scream or fight or break things in my house. We just needed to sit back and let Cynthia happily get on that massive luxury ship. The trap was perfectly set, and the guillotine was raised high into the air. The morning of the departure arrived with a heavy blanket of gray clouds hanging over the city. I stood silently in the doorway of our master bedroom, watching my wife of 40 years pack her bags for her grand betrayal. The large leather suitcases were spread wide open across the very bed we had shared for decades. Cynthia was humming a soft and joyful church hymn under her breath as she moved gracefully around the room. She was completely oblivious to the fact that I was watching her every single move with the cold and calculated eyes of a man who already knew the exact time of her execution. I leaned against the wooden doorframe and studied the items she was carefully folding into her expensive luggage. My heavy engineering eyes caught the bright flash of crimson silk and delicate black lace buried under a pile of modest cotton sweaters. Cynthia noticed my gaze, and her hands moved with a sudden, frantic speed. She quickly snatched a thick wool cardigan and threw it over the expensive lingerie, completely hiding the scandalous fabric from my view. She did not even look up at me when she offered her smooth and practiced lie. She told me the bright silk garments were just special ceremonial choir robes for the evening prayer services on the ship. She said the women in the church group wanted to dress formally to honor the spiritual speakers. I nodded my head slowly, keeping my face completely blank. I knew exactly what those clothes were. I knew because I was the one who had unknowingly paid for them. Those expensive boutique dresses and high-end silk nightgowns were purchased with the $45,000 she had secretly drained from my retirement account. She was packing clothes to seduce a 50-year-old criminal using the exact same money I had bled for down in the toxic engine rooms of commercial cargo ships. Every single silk thread in that suitcase represented an hour of my lost youth. Every designer label was paid for by the permanent ache in my knees and the heavy scar tissue on my shoulders. Yet she stood there humming a holy song, pretending to be a righteous woman on a sacred journey. The sheer magnitude of her hypocrisy was absolutely breathtaking. I watched her zip the heavy leather bags shut, sealing her dark secrets inside. She patted the top of the suitcase with a deeply satisfied smile. She genuinely believed she was a master manipulator who had completely outsmarted her tired old husband. We walked downstairs to the kitchen together. The house felt strangely hollow, as if the walls themselves knew that the foundation of our marriage had already been completely demolished. Cynthia walked over to the marble countertop and made a grand theatrical show of organizing my daily medications. She pulled out my plastic pill organizer and lined it up perfectly next to the coffee maker. She turned around to face me and put on her best mask of a loving and concerned wife. She reached out and patted my chest right over my tired heart. She looked deeply into my eyes and told me to please remember to take my blood pressure pills every single morning while she was gone. She said she would be absolutely devastated if anything bad happened to my health while she was out on the ocean praying for our family. The absolute cruelty of her words echoed loudly in my mind. She was standing in the kitchen of a house she had secretly and fraudulently remortgaged behind my back. She was preparing to leave me drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of illegal debt. She had secretly tried to make her criminal lover the primary beneficiary of my life insurance policy just 2 nights ago. She was actively setting the stage for my total financial and physical destruction, and yet she was sweetly reminding me to take my medicine so I would not have a heart attack. The old Wallace would have been deeply touched by her fake concern, but the man standing in front of her now felt absolutely nothing but a freezing cold, absolute clarity. I did not flinch away from her touch. I simply smiled, a warm and foolish smile, playing my part flawlessly to the very bitter end. I promised her I would take very good care of myself. I told her to focus entirely on her spiritual healing and not to worry about anything back home. I told her I wanted her to have the most unforgettable trip of her entire life. She smiled back brightly, completely missing the dark and heavy double meaning behind my words. A few minutes later, a sleek black luxury car pulled into our concrete driveway. Cynthia had ordered an expensive private car service to take her to the airport for her early morning flight to Miami. The driver stepped out and loaded her heavy designer suitcases into the spacious trunk. Cynthia stood on the front porch wearing a beautiful tailored coat and a wide-brimmed sun hat. She looked wealthy and entirely untouchable. She turned to me one last time to say goodbye. She did not hug me. She simply leaned forward and pressed a cold, dry peck against my rough cheek. It felt exactly like the icy touch of a total stranger. She told me she loved me and promised to call me when the ship finally left the port. I stood perfectly still on the wooden porch and watched her climb into the back seat of the black car. The heavy door closed with a solid thud separating us forever. The engine roared to life, and the car slowly backed out of the driveway. I watched the vehicle roll down the quiet suburban street and turn the corner, completely disappearing from my sight. The heavy silence of the empty neighborhood settled around me. For 40 years, this woman had been the center of my entire universe. I had fought for her, I had bled for her, and I had trusted her with my actual life. And now she was gone, racing eagerly toward the arms of a younger man and leaving me to face a mountain of illegal debt. But I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel any sorrow. The silent adjustment was no longer just a plan in my mind. It was a physical reality happening right now in real time. I did not go back inside the empty house. I simply stood on the porch and counted silently in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exactly 60 seconds after the black car disappeared from view, a massive, dark gray sport utility vehicle turned onto my street and rolled quietly toward my house. It was Todd. My brilliant and fiercely loyal son-in-law pulled into the exact same spot in the driveway where my treacherous wife had been standing just a moment ago. I walked over to the heavy wooden door of my garage and pulled it open. Tucked away, completely hidden behind my old heavy tools and rusted workbenches, were my own packed bags. I grabbed my heavy canvas duffel bags and walked out to the driveway. Todd stepped out of the driver's seat wearing a pair of dark sunglasses and a sharp, casual jacket. He popped the rear trunk open for me. We did not exchange any loud greetings. We did not need to celebrate or make any grand speeches. We were two incredibly focused men executing a highly complex and dangerous demolition project. I threw my heavy canvas bags into the back of the vehicle and slammed the trunk shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. I climbed into the comfortable passenger seat and fastened my seatbelt. Todd looked over at me and gave a single firm nod. He told me that Keisha was already at the airport waiting for us at the private departure lounge. My beautiful daughter had taken a leave of absence from the hospital to witness the total destruction of the mother who had betrayed us all. Todd put the heavy vehicle into gear and we pulled away from the house. I looked at my home in the side mirror one last time. The house was completely empty now, but it was safe. The legal guillotine was perfectly set in the trust documents, and the property was fully secured for my daughter. I had absolutely nothing tying me to the city anymore. We drove onto the massive highway, speeding toward the main international airport. We were taking a completely different flight to Miami, just 2 hours behind Cynthia. She thought she was running away to paradise with her stolen money and her secret lover. She thought she had completely escaped the consequences of her terrible actions. She had absolutely no idea that her quiet, tired old husband and her brilliant white son-in-law were currently hunting her down. She had no idea that we were heading to the exact same massive port in Florida to board the exact same luxury ocean liner. As the massive glass buildings of the Atlanta skyline faded behind us, I reached into my heavy leather jacket and felt the thick envelope resting securely against my chest. Inside that envelope were the golden tickets to her absolute doom. We were heading straight to Terminal A at the port of Miami. We were going to walk up that long gangway and step into the luxurious belly of that massive ship. It stretched for football fields in length, standing 15 decks high and gleaming with thousands of glass balconies under the bright Florida sun. Somewhere deep inside that floating fortress of luxury, my treacherous wife was settling into her $15,000 suite with a man who stole my life savings. I did not have time to dwell on my anger because the sound of loud and joyous laughter suddenly echoed across the crowded terminal. I turned around and saw them. It was a sea of matching, brightly colored vacation shirts and expensive wide-brimmed hats. It was Cynthia, entire, fiercely religious and deeply judgmental family. They were traveling in a massive pack of 8, dragging expensive luggage and talking over each other with absolute excitement. Leading the charge was her brother Thomas, the strict church deacon, walking with his chest puffed out in absolute pride. Right beside him was her sister Martha, the neighborhood gossip, who was already snapping dozens of photographs with her digital camera. And sitting right in the center of the chaotic group in a specialized travel wheelchair was the terrifying matriarch herself. Mother Matilda was 92 years old, but her eyes were just as sharp and unforgiving as a hunting hawk. When Matilda spotted me standing near the luggage drop-off, her wrinkled face broke into a massive and rare smile. She commanded Thomas to push her wheelchair directly toward me. The entire family swarmed around me, completely engulfing me in aggressive hugs and loud praises. Thomas patted me heavily on the back, declaring that I was the absolute greatest husband in the history of their church congregation. Martha wiped a dramatic tear from her eye and told me that Cynthia was the luckiest woman on the planet to be blessed with such a generous man. I stood there in the center of their loud affection, keeping my face completely calm and smiling warmly. Every single compliment they gave me felt like a heavy stone being added to the massive trap I had built for my wife. They had absolutely no idea that they were not here for a beautiful family reunion. They were here to serve as the jury and the executioners for the woman they were currently praising. My brilliant son-in-law Todd and my beautiful daughter Keisha stood quietly a few feet away, watching the chaotic family reunion. Todd gave me a subtle nod of respect. He knew exactly how much strength it took for me to stand there and accept their fake praises while knowing the dark and terrible truth. I stepped forward and gently kissed Matilda on her cheek, playing the role of the devoted son-in-law to absolute perfection. I reminded the entire loud group that this was a strict secret. I told them we had to be incredibly careful when we boarded the massive ship, because Cynthia believed she was traveling completely alone with her small church prayer group. I told them that if Cynthia spotted even one of them before the grand surprise dinner tomorrow night, the entire magical illusion would be completely ruined. The family nodded in absolute serious agreement. They treated my warning like a sacred holy mission. Thomas proudly appointed himself as the head of family security, aggressively whispering to his siblings to keep their heads down and their voices low. It was almost comical to watch these loud and arrogant people attempting to be stealthy. We moved together through the massive security checkpoints and finally walked up the long enclosed gangway onto the ship. The moment we stepped foot into the grand central promenade of the cruise ship, the sheer scale of my tactical problem became entirely obvious. The ship was a chaotic maze of thousands of wandering passengers, bright flashing casino lights and towering glass elevators. Keeping 8 loud and easily distracted relatives completely hidden from my wife was going to be a monumental logistical nightmare. Cynthia was staying in the exclusive owner's suite located on the private 14th deck. I had purposefully booked our 8 cabins down on the 11th deck to maintain a safe vertical distance between us. But the dining rooms, the massive theaters, and the swimming pools were all shared public spaces. The danger of a random encounter was incredibly high. Todd immediately stepped up to take control of the chaotic situation. He used his calm and authoritative corporate voice to herd the excited family members toward the aft elevators. He told them he had already downloaded the digital ship map to his phone and would personally guide them safely to their cabins without being detected. We managed to get the entire group into a massive glass elevator. But just as the heavy doors were closing, the situation almost completely unraveled. Matilda suddenly tapped her wooden cane sharply against the glass floor of the elevator. She announced in a loud and uncompromising voice that her blood sugar was dropping and she absolutely required her afternoon herbal tea before she went to any cabin. She pointed her crooked finger directly at a beautiful gold-plated sign outside the elevator doors on the 10th deck. The sign clearly read, Diamond VIP Lounge. It was an exclusive and private seating area strictly reserved for the highest-paying suite guests. It was exactly the kind of place Cynthia and her criminal lover, Derek, would be sitting right now, waiting for their room to be prepared. Matilda demanded that Thomas push her wheelchair straight into that lounge immediately. My heart completely stopped in my chest. If those heavy glass doors opened and Matilda rolled inside, she would come face to face with her married daughter drinking expensive champagne with a strange younger man. The entire trap would detonate prematurely in a messy and chaotic public explosion. Cynthia would have the chance to invent a lie to cause a massive scene and to play the victim before I had fully locked her financial chains in place. I froze completely, unable to think of a valid reason to stop a stubborn 92-year-old woman from getting her tea. But Keisha moved with the absolute lightning speed of an emergency room nurse. She stepped smoothly in front of the elevator doors, physically blocking her grandmother's path. Keisha flashed a brilliant and warm smile, completely hiding her internal panic. She leaned down and gently touched Matilda's hand. Keisha spoke in a soft, persuasive tone, telling her grandmother that the VIP lounge only served terrible, cheap tea bags. Keisha promised that if Matilda just waited 5 more minutes, they would go to the specialized international cafe on the 5th deck where they served authentic imported English breakfast tea in real porcelain cups. Matilda paused, her sharp eyes studying Keisha's face for a long, terrifying moment. Finally, the old woman gave a single slow nod and lowered her wooden cane. The crisis was averted by a mere fraction of a second. Todd quickly pressed the button for the lower decks, completely bypassing the dangerous VIP territory. I let out a long, silent breath of air, feeling the cold sweat trickling down my spine. We spent the next 2 exhausting hours navigating the lower decks, getting the entire Loud family checked into their rooms and settled. We ordered room service for them and convinced them to stay inside their comfortable cabins to rest before the evening departure. Once the family was finally contained behind locked wooden doors, I signaled to Todd and Keisha. We needed to confirm the location of our targets. We left the family hallway and walked briskly to the open-air observation deck on the 12th floor. The heavy ocean wind whipped across my face as I walked over to the thick glass railing. This specific public deck was located directly above the private luxury pool area that was strictly reserved for the suite guests. I leaned my heavy forearms against the glass and looked straight down into the exclusive VIP territory. It did not take me long to find her. Down below, lounging on a massive white circular daybed, was my wife. Cynthia was wearing a highly revealing imported swimsuit that I had never seen before in my entire life. She was sipping a bright pink tropical cocktail from a tall crystal glass, throwing her head back in loud, joyous laughter. And lying right next to her, completely invading her personal space, was the man who had stolen my retirement money. Derek looked exactly like his criminal mugshot, but dressed in expensive designer resort wear that my blood and sweat had paid for. I watched the two of them with the cold, detached observation of a scientist studying a completely foreign species. I felt absolutely no jealousy. I felt no heartbreak. The woman laughing on that white bed below me was entirely dead to me. Suddenly, Derek leaned over and wrapped his arm aggressively around Cynthia's waist. He pulled her close and buried his face deep into her neck, kissing her passionately in broad daylight for the entire VIP deck to see. Cynthia did not push him away. She leaned directly into his touch, wrapping her hands around his neck and smiling with absolute pure, wicked delight. I heard a sharp intake of breath beside me. Keisha was standing right next to me, gripping the glass railing so tightly that her knuckles were completely white. She was staring down at her own mother, witnessing the absolute destruction of our family with her own 2 eyes. I saw a single hot tear roll down my daughter's cheek, but she quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand. Her sadness instantly hardened into pure, unadulterated anger. Keisha reached into her pocket and pulled out her modern smartphone. She activated the high-resolution camera and utilized the maximum optical zoom. She steadied her hands against the metal railing and began to quietly take dozens of crystal-clear photographs. The digital shutter clicked rapidly, capturing the undeniable physical proof of the betrayal. She captured Derek kissing her neck. She captured Cynthia smiling and rubbing his chest. She captured the expensive luxury watches on their wrists and the absolute arrogance on their faces. Todd stepped up behind us and gently placed his hand on my shoulder. We did not need to speak. The evidence was secured. The family was completely trapped on the ship with us. The massive ocean liner let out a deafening blast from its heavy horn, vibrating the steel deck beneath my boots. The ship was finally pulling away from the Miami dock, completely severing our ties to the mainland. Cynthia was officially trapped in a floating steel prison with nowhere to run and absolutely nowhere to hide. I turned my back on the VIP deck and walked away from the railing. The heavy iron doors had slammed shut and the ammunition was securely locked and loaded. It was time to prepare the execution. The first full morning at sea broke with a brilliant and blinding blue horizon outside the small porthole window of my lower deck cabin. I woke up long before the sun, just as I had done for 40 years working in the commercial shipyards. I could feel the deep, rhythmic vibrations of the massive diesel engines humming hundreds of feet below me. To any normal passenger, it was just a gentle vibration. But to an old marine engineer like me, it was the familiar heartbeat of a massive machine. I poured myself a cup of standard black coffee from the small machine in my room and sat on the edge of the bed. We had successfully survived the initial boarding process without a single catastrophic encounter. Matilda and the rest of the Loud family were comfortably settled in their block of rooms down the hall, completely oblivious to the dangerous game being played right above their heads. A soft knock on my heavy cabin door broke the quiet morning silence. It was Todd and Keisha. They slipped quickly into my room carrying a silver tray of fresh pastries and a sleek modern tablet. Todd set the electronic device on the small circular table and woke up the bright screen. He told me he had spent the late hours of the night hacking into the ship internal network using the shared booking reference numbers. Because Cynthia had carelessly linked her onboard spending account to the very same bank cards I previously had access to, Todd was able to create a live digital mirror of every single transaction she made on the massive ship. We were essentially sitting in the dark belly of the vessel, watching her bleed my financial legacy dry in real time. Todd tapped the glass screen, and a long, cascading list of fresh digital receipts flooded the display. The sheer audacity of the luxury charges was absolutely staggering. At 8 in the morning, there was a $200 charge for premium room service, including imported caviar and expensive French champagne. At 10 o'clock, there was a $900 charge at the luxury ocean spa for a couple's massage and specialized youth facial treatments. Just an hour after that, there was a massive $1,200 charge from the high-end designer jewelry boutique located on the Central Promenade. I watched the bold numbers climb higher and higher. My hard-earned retirement money, the money I had sacrificed my physical cartilage and my youth to save, was currently buying silver necklaces and sparkling wine for a convicted romance scammer. Keisha paced back and forth across the small cabin floor. Her hands were balled into tight fists. She asked me how I could just sit there and watch my money disappear without marching up to the 14th deck and throwing both of them over the glass railing. I took a slow sip of my bitter coffee and looked calmly at my beautiful daughter. I reminded her that Cynthia was not spending my money anymore. I reminded her that because we had successfully executed the legal trust documents back in Atlanta, every single dollar Cynthia spent on this ship was only adding to her own massive, inescapable federal debt. I told Keisha we were not watching a robbery. We were watching a foolish woman happily dig her own financial grave with a golden shovel. Right at that moment, Keisha's phone buzzed in her pocket with a new social media notification. She pulled the device out and stared at the bright screen. I watched the warm color drain completely from her face, replaced instantly by a flush of pure burning rage. She handed the phone over to me, her hand trembling with absolute disgust. It was a new post on Cynthia's public profile page. The post was entirely visible to her entire church congregation back home and to every single member of her deeply religious family. The photograph on the screen showed Cynthia standing in front of a beautiful wooden podium with a large golden cross in the background. She was wearing a modest and elegant white dress, smiling with absolute holy serenity. The caption below the picture read that she was feeling so incredibly blessed to be surrounded by such faithful sisters on this spiritual journey at sea. She asked everyone to keep her in their daily prayers as she sought deep spiritual healing. But the picture was a complete and absolute lie. Todd leaned over and looked closely at the digital image. He pointed out the strange, blurry edges around Cynthia's hair and the unnatural lighting on her face. He explained that Cynthia had clearly used a modern photo editing application to digitally paste her own face onto a generic stock image of a church conference. She had likely taken a selfie in the luxurious marble bathroom of her $15,000 suite and then manipulated the background to maintain her pristine, holy disguise. Keisha was absolutely beside herself with anger. She wanted to immediately comment on the fake photograph. She wanted to upload the high-resolution picture she had taken yesterday showing her mother intimately kissing the young criminal on the exclusive pool deck. She wanted to burn Cynthia's entire holy reputation to the ground right there on the internet. I had to reach out and firmly hold Keisha by her wrists. I spoke to her in a low, heavy rumble, demanding her total focus. I told her that fighting a public war on the internet only gives the enemy time to prepare a legal defense. I told her that if she posted that picture right now, Cynthia would instantly know we were on the ship. The element of pure shock would be completely lost. The family would see it on their phones instead of experiencing the absolute devastation in person. I told my daughter to let her mother enjoy her fake digital praise for one more day because tomorrow night the real truth was going to hit her harder than a freight train. Keisha took a deep, ragged breath and slowly locked her phone, sliding it back into her pocket. The storm was temporarily contained, but the tension in the small cabin was thick enough to slice with a heavy steel blade. As the afternoon slowly faded into a dark and starry evening, Todd decided it was time to gather more active intelligence. Cynthia and Derek were completely comfortable now, believing they were entirely isolated in a floating paradise. Todd changed out of his sharp clothes and put on a casual, faded tropical shirt, a pair of worn canvas shorts, and dark aviator sunglasses. He looked exactly like any other ordinary tourist looking to lose a few $100s at the gambling tables. He left our cabin and rode the glass elevator up to the massive, glowing casino on the 6th deck. I stayed behind with Keisha, reviewing our strict operational plan for the grand family dinner the following night. 2 hours later, the heavy door to our cabin swung open. Todd walked in and securely locked the deadbolt behind him. He pulled off his dark sunglasses and let out a long, heavy sigh. He did not look angry. He looked completely and utterly disgusted. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket and placed it carefully on the center of the table. He told us he had found Derek sitting in the high roller section of the massive casino. Our young criminal friend was sitting at a private blackjack table surrounded by empty crystal glasses, completely blowing through thousands of dollars of my stolen retirement money. Todd explained that he had confidently walked up to the adjacent seat, ordered a strong drink, and quietly integrated himself into the chaotic environment of the table. Derek was incredibly arrogant and highly intoxicated. He was winning a few hands but losing significantly more, playing with the reckless and careless abandon of a man who was not gambling with his own hard-earned cash. Todd tapped the screen of his phone and hit the play button on a covert audio recording he had managed to capture while sitting right next to the thief. The audio quality was slightly muffled by the loud bells and sirens of the surrounding slot machines, but the voices were entirely clear. We heard Derek laughing loudly. We heard the bartender compliment Derek on his expensive new gold watch. And then we heard the absolute damning confession fall straight from Derek's own mouth. Derek boasted loudly to the bartender and the dealer that he had hit the ultimate absolute jackpot. He bragged that he had found himself a wealthy old sugar mama who was completely desperate for some youthful attention. He laughed a cruel and ugly laugh, explaining that she was happily footing the bill for the massive luxury suite, the premium alcohol, and his massive gambling stakes. He actually called my wife a foolish old cash machine. He said he just had to kiss her neck and whisper a few sweet empty words to keep the money flowing directly into his pockets. The recording clicked off, leaving a heavy and suffocating silence in our small cabin. Keisha stared at the dark phone with her mouth slightly open, completely paralyzed by the sheer evil and absolute manipulation she had just heard. The man sleeping with her mother did not even respect her. He viewed Cynthia as nothing more than a pathetic, easily manipulated source of free money. And Cynthia, in all her arrogant pride, was completely blind to the fact that she was being used exactly the same way she had been using me for decades. Todd looked at me and quietly asked if I wanted him to send the recording to the local authorities right now. I shook my head slowly. The police would eventually get their turn when the federal fraud charges caught up to them. But right now, this covert audio recording was the final piece of heavy ammunition I needed for the execution. I had the financial records proving her massive theft. I had the photographs proving her disgusting physical infidelity. And now I had the crystal clear audio recording proving the absolute pathetic reality of her new romance. The cat and mouse game was officially over. Tomorrow night, I was going to lock the heavy wooden doors to the private dining room, and I was going to let the monsters tear each other completely apart. The second day at sea arrived with a heavy rolling motion that only deep ocean waters can properly produce. I stood in the small bathroom of my lower deck cabin, splashing freezing cold water on my face and staring at the deep lines etched into my dark skin. 40 years of marriage had aged me terribly, but the last 48 hours had turned my heart into absolute solid steel. Today was the very day. Tonight was the night the entire beautiful lie would finally shatter into a million jagged pieces. I walked out into the small living area where my heavy canvas bag sat completely untouched in the corner. Todd and Keisha were already awake and waiting for me down in the main dining hall, having successfully kept the 8 loud family members distracted with a massive morning buffet breakfast. I left my quiet cabin and took the glass elevator up to the 4th deck where the primary guest services desk was located. I needed to secure the absolute perfect location for the execution. A regular public restaurant would not work at all. If Cynthia saw even one familiar face in a massive crowd, she would immediately turn around and run back to her luxury suite to hide. I needed a completely contained environment with heavy wooden doors that could be closed and locked from the inside to prevent any cowardly escapes. I spoke to the young woman standing behind the polished marble counter and told her I wanted to rent the private mahogany dining room located at the very back of the ship. I explained in a soft, gentle voice that I was hosting a highly exclusive family reunion and that it was a total surprise for my beautiful wife. The young woman smiled brightly, completely charmed by my fake story of lifelong romance and dedicated love. She charged my secure veteran account and handed me the heavy electronic keycard to the private room. The physical stage was officially secured, but now I faced the most difficult engineering problem of the entire operation. I needed to figure out exactly how to lure Cynthia out of her $15,000 penthouse suite and down into my trap without raising a single ounce of suspicion. If I sent a regular ship notification, she might just ignore it to spend more time drinking expensive champagne in bed with her young criminal lover. I had to appeal directly to the absolute ugliest part of her personality. I had to generously feed her massive, towering narcissism. I found Todd sitting alone in a quiet corner of the ship library surrounded by heavy wooden bookshelves. I sat down across from him and explained my difficult dilemma. My brilliant son-in-law simply smiled, a cold and calculating smile. He opened his laptop and told me that arrogant people are the absolute easiest targets in the world to catch because they always genuinely believe they deserve special treatment. Todd accessed the ship digital network and pulled up the official graphic design templates used by the cruise line. Within 20 minutes, he had completely forged a highly official-looking digital and physical invitation. The thick cardstock read that Cynthia was cordially invited to an exclusive Captain Diamond dinner in the private mahogany room. The fake invitation stated that only the absolute highest-paying VIP guests on the entire ship were personally selected for this grand honor. It promised free-flowing imported champagne, a private string quartet, and a personal meet-and-greet with the captain of the massive vessel. It was the exact kind of superficial elite garbage that Cynthia lived for every single day. She would never pass up an opportunity to parade around in her stolen designer clothes and feel vastly superior to the rest of the ordinary passengers. We went to the ship business center and printed the beautiful lie on the most expensive glossy paper they had available. Todd slipped it into a gold-embossed envelope and sealed it perfectly tight. But I could not simply slide the envelope under her heavy suite door myself. That would look entirely too common and highly suspicious for a supposed luxury dinner. It needed to be delivered by hand with the utmost professional respect to feed her massive ego. I told Todd to wait in the library while I walked down to the staff corridors on the third deck. I stood near the crew elevator and watched the young men and women rushing back and forth carrying heavy trays and fresh towels. I was looking for someone very specific. I folded the heavy money into the palm of my hand and held it out directly toward him. I told David that I needed a very small and completely harmless favor that would take less than 5 minutes of his valuable time. I explained that I was trying to surprise my wife for a grand romantic gesture, and I needed him to personally deliver a gold envelope directly to the owner's suite on the 14th deck. I told him he needed to knock firmly on the heavy door, hand her the envelope, and politely tell her the captain was personally looking forward to her beautiful presence tonight. David looked down at the $500 resting quietly in my calloused hand. That was likely more money than he made in 2 entire weeks of breaking his back on this massive floating hotel. He swallowed hard, looked up and down the empty hallway, and quickly slipped the cash deep into his uniform pocket. He took the gold envelope from my other hand and gave me a sharp, serious nod of respect. He promised me he would deliver it with absolute perfect professionalism and not say a single word to anyone else. I thanked him sincerely and watched him step into the crew elevator, heading straight up to the dangerous VIP territory. I turned around and walked slowly back to the library where Todd was waiting patiently. My old heart was pounding with a slow and heavy rhythm in my chest. The golden bait was officially dropped into the dark water. Now we just had to sit quietly and wait to see if the greedy fish would actually bite. Todd and I sat in the quiet library for what felt like an absolute eternity. Todd had his laptop open monitoring the internal ship network where he had cleverly routed the digital response link printed at the bottom of the fake invitation. If Cynthia scanned the digital code on the card, it would send a direct silent notification right to the computer screen in front of us. We sat in total suffocating silence, listening to the faint hum of the ship engines. Every single minute that ticked by felt like an entire hour of physical torture. I began to second-guess my entire engineering plan. What if she was too hungover from the bright casino last night to even answer the heavy door? What if Derek convinced her to stay in the room and order more expensive room service instead of getting dressed up? What if she simply did not care about meeting the captain because she was too busy destroying my life savings? My thick hands gripped the wooden arms of the library chair so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white with the pressure. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made for that woman over the last 4 decades. I thought about the severe burns on my arms and the permanent damage to my lungs from breathing toxic air, just so she could live in a beautiful house in the wealthy suburbs. I thought about how easily she had tossed all of that loyalty away for a smooth-talking criminal with massive federal debt. The anger burned hot and bright in my stomach, but I forced myself to remain completely still and perfectly silent. A true hunter never makes a sudden sound when the trap is fully set. Suddenly, a sharp, bright chime echoed quietly from the small speakers of the laptop. We both leaned forward instantly, staring at the glowing screen. A new notification had just popped up right in the center of the display. Todd's fingers flew rapidly across the keyboard, opening the digital response form that had just been transmitted through the ship network. A slow, cold smile spread completely across his face, reaching all the way to his eyes. He slowly turned the bright screen toward me so I could see the final result with my own 2 eyes. Cynthia had scanned the code. She had read the fake invitation, and her massive, towering ego had completely taken over her rational mind. She had officially clicked the button to accept the invitation to the private mahogany dining room. But she did not just accept the invitation for herself alone. Todd pointed to a small text box located at the very bottom of the digital form. Cynthia had filled out the special request section with her own bold words. She had arrogantly typed that she would be bringing a highly esteemed +1 to the exclusive event. She had manually entered the name of Derek onto the VIP guest list, completely sealing his absolute doom right alongside hers. She actually believed she was going to parade her young criminal lover in front of the ship captain while proudly spending my stolen retirement money. She had taken the golden bait, completely swallowing the heavy hook without a single second of hesitation. I leaned back in the heavy wooden chair and let out a long, heavy breath of air. The trap was perfectly armed and fully locked. Tonight the heavy mahogany doors would close shut, and my treacherous wife would finally walk blindly into her completely unavoidable destruction. The evening sun was sinking low into the vast black Atlantic as the massive ship vibrated with the energy of 1,000 high-end celebrations. Up on the 14th deck in the gold-plated mirrors of the owner's suite, Cynthia stood admiring her reflection with a look of pure and undisturbed triumph. She was wearing a shimmering designer gown that hugged her frame perfectly, a dress that cost more than I used to make in 3 months of grueling labor at the shipyard. She reached up and adjusted a sparkling diamond necklace around her throat, feeling the cold weight of the stones against her skin. Every single thread she wore and every jewel that caught the light was a trophy of her successful theft. She truly believed she had finally escaped the boring and predictable life of a shipyard worker wife to become the woman she was always meant to be. Beside her, Derek was adjusting the cuffs of a tailored Italian tuxedo. He looked like a man who had never worked a day in his life because he hadn't. He looked like a man who lived off the dreams and savings of others. He caught Cynthia's eye in the mirror and gave her a slow, arrogant smirk. He reached out and traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, telling her she looked like a queen who finally found her kingdom. Cynthia beamed with pride. Her vanity was a bottomless pit, and Derek knew exactly how to fill it with the right hollow words. They were 2 predators who believed they had found the ultimate prey in a tired old man back in Atlanta. They picked up their crystal glasses of pre-dinner champagne and toasted to their new beginning. They were ready to make their grand entrance at the exclusive Captain Diamond dinner. They stepped out of their suite and began their walk of pride through the upper decks of the ship. They did not just walk, they paraded. Cynthia held her head high, her gaze scanning the crowds of ordinary passengers with a look of thinly veiled condescension. She wanted to be seen. She wanted everyone on this vessel to notice her expensive clothes and her handsome younger companion. They walked through the grand atrium where the glass elevators rose and fell like golden bubbles. Derek kept his hand possessively on the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd with an air of absolute ownership. They were untouchable. They were the elite. They were the masters of a world built on a foundation of forged signatures and stolen retirement funds. But as they approached the bank of main elevators on the 10th deck, the first crack in their perfect illusion nearly shattered everything. I was watching from a distance, hidden behind a large, decorative marble pillar. My heart hammered against my ribs as I saw Cynthia, brother Thomas, stepping out of a nearby gift shop. Thomas was dressed in his stiffest Sunday suit, looking every bit the stern church deacon he was. He was heading straight for the exact same elevator bank where Cynthia and Derek were waiting. If Thomas looked up, he would see his sister dressed like a Hollywood starlet draped over a man who was definitely not her husband. The explosion would happen right there in the middle of the hallway, and my carefully engineered trap would be ruined. I saw Todd moving before I could even process the danger. My son-in-law was standing near the elevator buttons holding a tall glass of dark, staining cranberry juice. As Thomas approached the elevator doors, Todd pivoted sharply on his heel. He timed it with the absolute precision of a forensic auditor. Just as Thomas was about to step into the line of sight of the owner suite guests, Todd stumbled forward with a loud and dramatic gasp. He collided directly with Thomas' shoulder, and the entire glass of dark red liquid splashed across the front of Thomas' crisp, white dress shirt. Thomas let out a loud shout of pure shock and frustration. He looked down at the massive red stain spreading across his chest, his face turning a deep shade of angry purple. Todd was immediately all over him, apologizing with a frantic and clumsy energy. He grabbed a handful of napkins and began dabbing at Thomas' chest, blocking the man view of the elevator doors entirely. Todd leaned in close and spoke loudly about his own clumsiness, creating a wall of noise and distraction. Behind Thomas' back, the elevator doors slid open. Cynthia and Derek stepped inside, laughing at something Derek had just whispered. The doors hissed shut, and they began their descent to the 4th deck. They had no idea they had missed a head-on collision with the truth by a matter of inches. Todd watched the elevator floor indicator lights move, and then he stepped back from Thomas. He offered to pay for the dry cleaning and pointed Thomas toward the nearest restroom, giving us the precious minutes we needed to reset the stage. Cynthia and Derek stepped out of the elevator on the 4th deck, feeling like the guests of honor for the entire ocean. The air down here was quieter and smelled of expensive mahogany and aged leather. They walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the very back of the ship, where the most exclusive dining rooms were hidden away from the noise of the general public. Cynthia smoothed her shimmering dress one last time, her heart fluttering with the excitement of social validation. She imagined the ship captain, a man of high authority, standing to greet her. She imagined the other wealthy couples leaning in to hear her stories about her faithful service to the church. She felt like she had finally reached the pinnacle of her existence. They reached the end of the hallway where 2 massive hand-carved mahogany doors stood closed and imposing. A heavy brass plaque on the wall read Private Dining Room 1. Standing outside the doors was a ship steward in a pristine white uniform. He looked at Cynthia and Derek and gave a low, respectful bow. He asked if they were here for the diamond event. Cynthia lifted her chin and replied with a voice full of unearned authority that she was indeed the primary guest on the list. The steward turned and placed his hands on the heavy brass handles of the doors. Cynthia took Derek's arm and leaned into him, her eyes bright with greed and anticipation. She expected to walk into a room filled with soft violin music, the scent of fresh lilies, and the popping of expensive champagne corks. She expected a standing ovation for her status and her beauty. She had no idea that behind those heavy wooden doors the lights were dimmed and 8 members of her own blood family were sitting in total silence around a long candlelit table. She had no idea that her quiet, oblivious husband was sitting at the head of that table holding a remote control that would play the sounds of her own betrayal for everyone to hear. The steward pulled the heavy doors open, and Cynthia stepped forward into the darkness, her smile wide and her pride reaching its absolute peak. She was walking into the grandest dinner of her life, and she was about to discover that she was the only thing on the menu. The heavy mahogany doors felt like the entrance to a royal sanctuary as they began to swing inward with a slow and rhythmic grace. Cynthia adjusted her grip on Derek's arm, her fingers digging slightly into the fine wool of his expensive tuxedo. She stood tall, her chin lifted high, her eyes already scanning the dim interior of the private dining room for the flash of the captain's gold-braided uniform. She was breathing in the scent of aged wood, expensive wax, and the faint, lingering aroma of high-end vintage wine. In her mind, this was the absolute pinnacle of her life. She was no longer just the wife of a retired shipyard engineer. She was a woman of mystery, a woman of elite status, walking into a room where only the most exclusive guests were invited to sit. She felt Derek's body move with hers, his presence radiating an arrogant and youthful confidence that made her feel decades younger. She was ready for the champagne, the elite conversation, and the validation of her new, stolen life. The steward stepped back into the shadows of the hallway as the doors reached their full extension. For a brief, heartbeat of a second, the room remained shrouded in a warm, intimate darkness, lit only by the flickering glow of several dozen tall white candles arranged meticulously down the center of a massive banquet table. Cynthia stepped forward into the room, her high heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. She was smiling her most radiant, practiced church smile. Then, the heavy silence was shattered by a sudden, deafening explosion of sound. Surprise. The word ripped through the air with the force of a physical blast. The overhead crystal chandeliers suddenly flared to life, bathing the entire room in a blinding, unforgiving white light. Cynthia stopped dead in her tracks, her breath hitching in her throat as her eyes struggled to adjust to the sudden brightness. As the spots cleared from her vision, her smile did not just fade. It vanished as if it had been wiped away by a cold, wet cloth. Standing around the massive mahogany table, their faces flushed with a mixture of forced joy and genuine excitement, were the very people she had spent her entire life trying to impress and deceive. It was her entire family, every single one of them. Her brother Thomas was there, his hands raised in the air as if he were leading a Sunday service. Her sister Martha was clutching a camera, her eyes bright with the thrill of the secret. Her cousins, her nieces, and her nephews were all leaning forward, their mouths still open from the final echo of their shout. But right at the center of the group, seated in her specialized travel wheelchair like a queen on a throne of judgment, was Matilda. My wife's 92-year-old mother stared directly at her daughter, her sharp, hawk-like eyes magnified by her thick glasses. Matilda had been waiting for this moment since I first called her in Atlanta, and she was radiating a terrifying energy of holy expectation. The silence that followed the shout was heavier than any noise. Cynthia's body went completely rigid. Her hand, which had been resting so proudly on Derek's arm just a second ago, now looked like it was frozen in ice. She stared at her mother, then at Thomas, then at Martha. Her mind, usually so quick to invent a beautiful lie, was completely paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the scene in front of her. She was supposed to be in a private VIP heaven with her young lover. Instead, she had walked directly into the center of her own family's judgmental gaze. Beside her, Derek's reaction was far more primitive. The professional scammer, the man who had spent his life navigating the shadows of romance fraud and IRS debt, instantly recognized the smell of a trap. His arrogant smirk collapsed into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an exit, but the heavy mahogany doors had already been pulled shut by the steward behind them. His hands began to tremble violently. The crystal glass of expensive pre-dinner champagne he had been holding slipped from his fingers. The glass hit the polished mahogany floor with a sharp, crystalline crack. It shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, sending a spray of golden liquid across the hem of Cynthia's shimmering designer gown. The sound of the breaking glass seemed to wake the family from their joyful trance. Thomas, the strict deacon, was the first to notice the stranger standing next to his sister. He lowered his arms slowly, his brow furrowing into a deep, dark line of confusion. He looked at the younger man in the tuxedo, then he looked at the way Cynthia's hand was still draped over the stranger's arm. The joy in his face began to drain away, replaced by a slow, simmering suspicion. Matilda did not wait for an explanation. She leaned forward in her wheelchair, her gnarled hands gripping the wooden armrests. She looked at Cynthia's revealing designer dress, then she looked at the diamonds around her neck, and finally her gaze settled on Derek with the cold intensity of a funeral director. "Cynthia," Matilda's voice cracked through the room like a whip, sharp and devoid of any warmth. "What is the meaning of this? Where is Wallace? And who is this young thug you are holding on to like a common street girl?" The words hung in the air, vibrating with the weight of decades of strict religious morality. The rest of the family members began to murmur among themselves, their smiles disappearing one by one as the reality of the situation began to settle into the room. Martha lowered her camera, her eyes narrowing as she studied Derek's panicked face. The air in the room, which had been filled with the scent of celebration, was now thick with the unmistakable aroma of an impending disaster. Cynthia tried to speak, her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She was desperately searching for a script, a way to explain why she was dressed like a movie star and standing in the arms of a 50-year-old stranger while her entire family watched. She looked at Matilda, her eyes wide with terror, but no words would come. She was a master of the digital lie, a queen of the Photoshop church seminar, but standing here in the cold, bright reality of the physical world, her power had completely evaporated. Derek took a clumsy step backward, trying to distance himself from the woman he had called his sugar mama just yesterday. He began to stammer, his voice thin and cracking. I think there has been a mistake," he whispered, his eyes still searching for a way out of the mahogany prison. "I am just a friend, a business associate." Matilda's lip curled in a gesture of absolute, unmitigated disgust. "A business associate," she hissed, her voice rising in volume. "You are dressed for a wedding, and you are standing in a private room with a married woman. You look like a thief and a liar." Cynthia finally found her voice, but it was a weak, trembling shadow of the woman she had been 5 minutes ago. "Mama," she started, her eyes filling with hot, desperate tears. "Please, it is not what it looks like. We were invited to a special dinner. Wallace, he must be around here somewhere." She turned her head frantically, looking at the empty seats around the table, hoping against hope that I would magically appear and provide a lie that would save her. She was drowning in the middle of the ocean, and she was looking for the very man she had spent the last month trying to destroy. It was exactly the moment I had been engineering since that rainy Tuesday morning in Atlanta. I had been sitting in a high-backed leather chair at the very head of the long banquet table, positioned perfectly within the deep shadows cast by a heavy velvet curtain. I had watched every single second of the entrance. I had watched her walk in with her pride. I had watched Derek drop his glass in cowardice. I had heard the sharp, righteous judgment in Matilda's voice. I had remained perfectly still, a silent ghost in the corner of the room, waiting for the absolute peak of the tension. I stood up slowly. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned with a familiar, heavy sound. I stepped out from behind the curtain and moved into the bright, unforgiving circle of light at the head of the table. I was wearing my best black suit, the one I usually saved for the most important church funerals. My back was perfectly straight. My head was held high. I looked at my wife, and for the first time in 40 years, I saw her for exactly what she was. A small, greedy, and incredibly foolish woman who had traded a lifetime of loyalty for a handful of silver and a young man's lies. The room went completely silent. It was a silence so profound and so absolute that you could hear the distant rhythmic hum of the ship's engines vibrating through the floor. Every single eye in the room was fixed on me. Cynthia's face turned a sickly, ashen gray. She looked like she was about to collapse onto the mahogany floor right next to the broken glass. I looked at the diamonds around her neck, the ones bought with my blood and sweat. Then I looked into her terrified eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or point my finger in rage. I spoke in a low, heavy, and perfectly calm rumble that echoed off the mahogany walls with the weight of a final judgment. "Hello, darling," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a cold steel blade. "Are you enjoying your church retreat so far?" The irony of the words was a physical weight in the room. I let the question hang there, watching as the realization of her total and absolute ruin began to sink into her mind. I looked at Matilda, then at Thomas, then at the shattered glass on the floor. The stage was set. The audience was ready, and the execution was finally about to begin. The heavy silence in the private mahogany dining room lasted only as long as it took for the shock to wear off and the righteous fury of an insulted family to take its place. My words had cut through the air like a cold blade, and the initial paralysis of my wife was beginning to crumble. The room suddenly erupted into a chaotic storm of voices. My brother-in-law Thomas stepped forward, his face a dark shade of crimson, his hand pointing accusingly at Derek. He demanded to know exactly what kind of church retreat required a shimmering designer gown and a younger man in a tuxedo. Martha began to pace back and forth, her eyes darting between Cynthia and the broken glass on the floor as she whispered to the other cousins about the absolute disgrace of it all. Matilda sat in her wheelchair, her thin lips pressed into a hard line of pure judgment as she watched her daughter struggle to breathe. Cynthia looked around the room like a trapped animal searching for a hole in the fence. Her eyes were wide and glossy with tears of desperation. She finally found her voice, but it was not the confident and arrogant voice she had used in our kitchen back in Atlanta. It was a high-pitched and shaky tremolo that sounded entirely unconvincing. She looked at her mother and then at the rest of the family, her hands fluttering nervously at her throat. She claimed that we were all making a terrible and tragic mistake. She told them that Derek was not a romantic companion at all. She took a deep, ragged breath and announced to the room that Derek was actually her new private spiritual advisor. She claimed that the church elders had recommended him to help her through a deep personal crisis that I was too old and too tired to understand. She said the expensive suite and the fine clothes were simply necessary tools to help her feel worthy of the blessings she was receiving through their prayer sessions. The lie was so incredibly thin and so obviously fabricated that it actually made the room go quiet again for a brief second. Matilda let out a sharp and bitter laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping against a gravestone. She looked at her daughter's low-cut dress and the way Derek was currently trying to hide behind her shoulder. She asked Cynthia if prayer sessions now required kissing on the neck in broad daylight on the pool deck. Cynthia's face went from pale gray to a bright and burning red. She tried to deny it, claiming that Matilda's aging eyes were simply playing tricks on her in the bright Florida sun. She started to ramble about faith and forgiveness and the importance of not judging others, but the more she spoke, the more she sounded like a guilty child caught in a blatant lie. That was the exact moment when my daughter Keisha decided she had heard enough. I watched her walk slowly and purposefully toward the large, smart television that was mounted on the mahogany wall of the dining room. She did not say a single word to her mother. She did not even look at her. Keisha's face was a mask of cold and absolute determination. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out her smartphone. She tapped the screen with a sharp and precise motion. Because Todd had already synced our devices to the ship's internal media network, Keisha was able to take complete control of the large display. The screen flickered to life, bathing the room in a bright digital glow. Cynthia stopped talking, her mouth hanging open in mid-sentence as she turned to see the television. The first image that appeared on the screen was the high-resolution photograph Keisha had taken from the observation deck yesterday. It was a crystal-clear shot of Cynthia and Derek on the private VIP daybed. The camera had captured the exact moment Derek's face was buried in the side of her neck, and Cynthia's eyes were closed in pure bliss. The detail was so sharp that you could see the sweat on Derek's forehead and the absolute joy on my wife's face. A collective gasp went up from the family. Thomas covered his mouth in absolute horror, and Martha's eyes went wide as she moved closer to the screen to inspect the evidence. Matilda let out a low and heavy groan of pure disgust. Cynthia's legs seemed to give out beneath her, and she had to grab the edge of the heavy dining table to keep from falling onto the broken glass. She started to stammer that the photo was a fake, that it was a digital manipulation meant to ruin her reputation. But Keisha was not finished yet. She swiped her finger across the phone screen and a second photo appeared. Then a third. Then a dozen more. Each one showed a different angle of their physical intimacy. They showed them holding hands at the bar. They showed Derek whispering into her ear while she laughed. They showed the absolute physical reality of their betrayal in a way that no lie could ever cover up. But the physical evidence was only the beginning of the execution. Keisha tapped the screen one final time, and the television speakers let out a low, static hiss. The room went deathly quiet as a recorded voice began to play through the high-end audio system. It was the recording Todd had captured in the casino. We heard the loud bells of the slot machines and the clinking of glasses. And then we heard Derek's voice loud and clear. We heard him bragging to the bartender about his wealthy old sugar mama. We heard him calling my wife a foolish old cash machine. We heard him explain in a cruel and mocking tone how easy it was to keep the money flowing by just whispering a few sweet words into her ear while he spent her savings at the blackjack table. The sound of Derek's own voice mocking her in front of her entire family was the final blow that shattered Cynthia's spirit. She looked at Derek, her eyes filled with a sudden and terrifying realization. The man she had sacrificed her 40-year marriage for did not even respect her. He did not love her. He viewed her as a pathetic and easily manipulated tool to fund his criminal lifestyle. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She turned toward him, her hands shaking with rage, and asked him if he really said those things about her. She asked him if she was really just a sugar mama to him. Derek's reaction was the absolute peak of his cowardice. Throughout the entire confrontation, he had been trying to maintain his smooth and arrogant persona, but seeing the physical evidence and hearing his own voice had completely stripped away his mask. He looked at the angry faces of Cynthia's brothers and cousins. He saw the way Thomas was rolling up his sleeves and the way the younger men in the family were starting to move toward him with dark and dangerous intentions. Derek was a professional scammer who preyed on vulnerable women, but he was not a fighter. He was a small and pathetic man who only had courage when he was in total control of the situation. The moment he realized that his life of luxury was over and that he was physically trapped in a room with an angry family, he completely snapped. His fake bravado crumbled into a heap of pure and ugly panic. He did not try to comfort Cynthia or defend her. Instead, he took a sharp step back and violently shoved her away from him. Cynthia stumbled backward, her heels slipping on the polished wood, and she crashed heavily into an empty chair. Derek did not even look down to see if she was hurt. He turned toward the family, his hands raised in the air, his face a mask of sweating and shaking terror. He screamed at the top of his lungs that it was not his fault. He yelled that Cynthia was the one who had started everything. He looked at me and then at Matilda and shouted that Cynthia had lied to him from the very first day they met at the church. He claimed that she had told him she was a wealthy widow who had been divorced for over 10 years. He yelled that he never would have touched her if he knew she was still married to a man who looked like he could break him in half. He called my wife a crazy and desperate old woman who wouldn't leave him alone. He claimed she was the one who forced him to come on this cruise and that she was the one who kept throwing money at him until he couldn't say no. I stood at the head of the table watching him with the same calm and steady gaze I used when I watched a failing engine finally burn itself out. The hook was set so deep that there was no way he was ever going to pull it out. The execution was moving into its final and most brutal phase. Derek lunged for the heavy mahogany doors, his eyes wide with the frantic terror of a cornered animal. He didn't care about his tailored tuxedo or his polished shoes or the image of the sophisticated lover he had been projecting for the last 48 hours. He was a professional scammer who lived in the shadows of lies, and the moment the bright light of truth hit him, he scrambled for the nearest exit like a rat in a basement, but he didn't even make it halfway to the handle. My brother-in-law Thomas, the man who had spent 30 years as a strict deacon in our church, moved with a speed and a strength that belied his age. Thomas stepped directly into Derek's path, his massive shoulders blocking the light from the hallway. Thomas didn't say a word. He simply folded his arms across his chest and stared down at the younger man with the cold and unwavering gaze of a man who had spent his life protecting his family. Right beside him, Todd stepped up, his face a mask of quiet and absolute authority. My son-in-law was not a physically imposing man, but he stood with the confidence of someone who held every single one of Derek's dirty secrets in his pocket. Derek skidded to a stop on the polished wood floor, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He looked at Thomas, then he looked at Todd, and then he looked back at the rest of the family members who were slowly closing the circle around him. His fake bravado had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a sweating and trembling coward. He started to stammer again, claiming that he was being held against his will and that he would call the ship's security. Thomas let out a low growl that sounded like distant thunder and told Derek to sit back down before he forgot his holy vows and gave him something real to cry about. Derek collapsed back into a chair near the edge of the room, his head hanging low, his hands shaking so violently that he had to tuck them under his thighs. The arrogant young man who had been kissing my wife's neck on the pool deck was gone. In his place was a pathetic shell of a human being who had been caught in the middle of a massive fraud. The family members did not look at him with pity. They looked at him with the kind of pure, unadulterated disgust you reserve for something rotting on the side of the road. But as pathetic as Derek looked, the real tragedy was sitting right in the center of the room. Cynthia was slumped in her high-backed chair, her shimmer designer gown looking like a costume from a play that had gone terribly wrong. The realization of Derek's betrayal, the sound of his voice calling her a foolish sugar mama, had finally broken through her wall of narcissism. She looked around the room, her eyes red and swollen with hot, desperate tears. She saw her brothers, her sisters, her cousins, and her nieces all staring at her with looks of absolute betrayal. She realized in that moment that she had not just lost her husband, she had lost her entire world. She had traded her family, her reputation, and her dignity for a man who didn't even know her middle name. In a final, desperate attempt to save herself, Cynthia slid out of her chair and fell to her knees on the hard mahogany floor. She ignored the broken glass and the spilled champagne. She began to crawl slowly toward her mother. She reached out her hands and grabbed the hem of Matilda's long conservative dress. She started to sob loudly, her voice a high-pitched and agonizing wail that echoed off the high ceilings. She begged her mother for forgiveness. She screamed that she had been under a spell, that Derek had used dark psychological tricks to confuse her mind. She told Matilda that she was still the same devoted daughter she had always been. She promised that if her mother would just stand by her and tell the family to forgive her, she would spend the rest of her life making it up to them. She was using every single emotional weapon in her arsenal, trying to trigger the maternal instinct of the woman who had raised her. The room went deathly silent. Every single eye was fixed on Matilda. For 92 years, this woman had been the moral compass of our entire family. She had seen everything. She had survived the Jim Crow South, she had raised 5 children on a maid's salary, and she had built a reputation for holiness that was untouched in our community. I watched her look down at the daughter she had once been so proud of. Matilda's face did not soften. She did not reach out to comfort the crying woman at her feet. Instead, her wrinkled face hardened into a mask of pure and absolute righteous judgment. Matilda pulled her dress out of Cynthia's trembling hands as if she were touching something diseased. She leaned forward in her wheelchair, her eyes burning with a cold and terrifying fire. She spoke in a voice that was low, but it carried more power than any scream. She told Cynthia that she was not her daughter. She told her that the daughter she raised had a soul and a sense of shame. She said that a woman who would steal from her own husband and daughter to feed a common thief was nothing more than a stranger to her. Matilda looked at the shimmering diamonds around Cynthia's neck and told her that those stones were made of Wallace's blood, and that every time she looked in the mirror she was seeing a thief staring back at her. Then Matilda did something I will never forget. She leaned down and with a look of absolute unmitigated disgust, she spat directly at the floor at Cynthia's feet. It was the ultimate gesture of disowning a child. It was a sign that the bond was broken forever. Matilda looked up at Thomas and Martha and commanded them to take her out of that room. She told the rest of the family that there was nothing left for them to see. She said that they were leaving Cynthia to the darkness she had chosen for herself. I watched as the family members began to move. They followed Matilda's command without a single word of protest. They walked past Cynthia as if she were invisible. Thomas didn't look back. Martha didn't offer a single word of gossip. One by one, they filed out of the private mahogany dining room, their footsteps heavy and somber on the wooden floor. The doors were opened and the hallway light spilled into the room for a brief moment before the last relative walked out and the steward closed the doors again. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The large banquet hall, which had been filled with the noise of an entire family just minutes ago, was now a hollow and silent stage for the final act. Cynthia remained on the floor, her forehead resting against the dark wood, her body shaking with silent sobs. Derek stayed frozen in his chair, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall, afraid to even breathe. Only 4 of us remained at the table. Me, Todd, Keisha, and the 2 people who had tried to destroy us. Keisha stood near the television, her face a mask of cold medical precision. She didn't look at her mother with anger anymore. She looked at her with a clinical detachment, as if she were observing a patient who was already too far gone to save. Todd sat beside me, his laptop closed, his job of tracking the digital lies finally complete. He was waiting for me to take the lead. I sat at the head of the table, my hands folded calmly on the white linen cloth. I looked at the woman who had been my wife for 40 years. I remembered the day we got married, the small church in Georgia, the heat of that summer afternoon, and the way she had promised to be faithful until death. I thought about the thousands of morning coffees we had shared and the house we had built together. All of that history had been incinerated in a single month of greed. I didn't feel the need to yell. I didn't feel the need to call her names or throw the broken glass at her. The anger had been replaced by a quiet and absolute sense of duty. I had spent my life as an engineer fixing things that were broken, but I knew when a structure was beyond repair. Cynthia had compromised the foundation of our life, and I was here to finish the demolition. I reached into the inside pocket of my black suit jacket. My movements were slow and deliberate. Cynthia looked up from the floor, her eyes red and puffy, hoping for a final moment of mercy. She probably thought I was reaching for a handkerchief to wipe her tears, or a phone to call for help. She was still expecting me to be the same soft and oblivious man she had walked all over for decades. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I placed it on the polished mahogany table, and then, with a single smooth motion, I slid it across the wood. The folder skated over the surface and came to a stop directly in front of Cynthia. "Everything you need to know about your future is in that folder, Cynthia," I said, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any emotion. "The cash you stole, the house you mortgaged, and the criminal you brought on this ship, it is all accounted for." She stared at the folder, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the paper. She didn't know it yet, but inside that folder was the legal guillotine that would strip her of her home, her money, and her freedom. She thought the humiliation in front of the family was the end of her punishment, but she was wrong. It was only the beginning. The silent adjustment was moving into the financial execution, and I was going to make sure she felt every single second of the fall. The hook was locked and the noose was finally tightening around her neck. Cynthia remained on the polished mahogany floor, her fingers trembling as they touched the edge of the heavy manila folder. The air in the private dining room was still thick with the scent of the expensive perfume she had bought with my stolen money and the bitter metallic tang of the shattered champagne glass. She slowly pulled the folder toward her as if it were a bomb that might detonate at any moment. She was looking for a way out, searching for some kind of legal loophole or a final piece of leverage she could use to save her crumbling reputation. She finally managed to get her fingers under the flap and pulled out the thick stack of white papers. I sat at the head of the table watching her with the same steady and clinical focus I used when I had to inspect a failing pressure valve deep in the hull of a ship. I did not feel any pleasure in her terror, but I felt a profound sense of structural balance. The chaos she had created was finally being met with an equal and opposite force of order. Cynthia's eyes darted across the first page. She expected to see divorce papers or a restraining order. Instead, her eyes locked onto the words, "Irrevocable Trust Agreement." She looked up at me, her face a mask of total and absolute confusion. She asked me what this was. She asked why our daughter Keisha was listed as the sole trustee and primary beneficiary of our family estate. I leaned forward slightly, the candlelight reflecting in my dark eyes. I spoke in a low, heavy rumble that filled the silent room. I told her very clearly that the house was gone. I explained that while she was busy forging my signature and lying to the bank to secure a fraudulent second mortgage, I was working with Todd and a team of high-level forensic attorneys. Because the mortgage she obtained was based entirely on criminal forgery, the bank claim to the property was legally compromised. We used that window of time to move the entire deed into a protected trust for our daughter. I watched the realization hit her like a physical blow. I told her that she no longer had any legal claim to the roof over her head. The house that I had paid for with 40 years of physical labor was now safely in Keisha's hands, where no creditor and no greedy wife could ever touch it again. Cynthia started to scream that it was illegal that she was still my wife and she had rights to half of everything. I didn't even blink. I told her that a person who commits bank fraud and identity theft loses their seat at the table of rights. I informed her that Todd had already delivered a full digital dossier of her forged documents to the fraud department of our bank and the local authorities in Atlanta. The moment she stepped off this ship, she would not be heading back to our suburban home. She would be heading to a police station to answer for the mountain of illegal debt she had created. Derek was sitting in the corner, his head buried in his hands, but his ears were sharp. When he heard the words bank fraud and police station, he let out a low whimper of pure cowardice. He realized that his sugar mama was not just broke, she was a criminal target. I turned my gaze toward him for a brief second and saw him shrink even further into his chair. He was realizing that the luxury life he had been enjoying was about to turn into a federal nightmare. Cynthia ignored him, her focus entirely on the folder. She flipped to the next page, which contained the frozen bank statements. She saw the bright red stamps across the accounts she had been draining. I told her that every single joint account was now officially locked under a legal hold. She had zero access to the remaining funds. Every penny she had left was currently sitting on that table in the form of a diamond necklace and a designer dress. But the physical assets were not the most immediate problem she was facing. I watched her hands shake as she realized the walls were closing in, but she still didn't understand the true depth of the trap I had set right here on the ship. I leaned back in my chair and took a final slow sip of my water. I told her that we needed to talk about the immediate future of her luxury vacation. I reminded her that this massive floating palace operated on credit and room charges. I told her that Todd had been monitoring her spending in real time from the moment we left the port in Miami. I watched her eyes go wide with a new kind of fear. I told her that exactly 24 hours ago, while we were still moving through the deep ocean, I had placed a final phone call to the primary credit card company. I had reported her main card as stolen and permanently canceled the entire account. I watched the color drain from her face as she realized the implications. I told her that the $15,000 owner suite she was currently occupying had only been secured with a temporary authorization. The final payment was due to be processed by the ship accounting department tomorrow morning. Since the card was now dead, the ship would not be able to collect a single cent for the room. But it was even worse than that. I pointed a finger toward the cowed man in the corner. I reminded her that she had been foolish enough to link Derek's room key directly to her own spending account. I told her we had been watching Derek at the blackjack table last night. She was a woman of mystery and high status, but she was doing it with $0 in her pocket and a $20,000 debt hanging over her head. Cynthia began to wail a high-pitched sound of pure agony. She looked at the trust papers, then at the frozen bank statements, and then at the coward Derek, who wouldn't even look her in the eye. She realized that the husband she had treated like a foolish old man had systematically removed every single safety net from beneath her feet. She was standing in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with a criminal lover who hated her, a family that had disowned her, and a legal system that was waiting to put her in a cage. I stood up from the head of the table, my back perfectly straight. I didn't need to say another word. The financial execution was complete. The silent adjustment had turned her dream of paradise into a floating prison of her own making. I turned my back on the woman who had betrayed me and walked toward the mahogany doors, leaving her to face the cold, hard reality of the numbers she had tried so hard to manipulate. The noose was tight and the floor was about to drop. The air in the private dining room was so thin and still that you could hear the flickering of the candles and the ragged, shallow breathing of the woman who had been my wife for 40 years. Cynthia sat slumped in her chair, the heavy manila folder open before her like a map of her own ruined territory. She looked at the trust documents, then at the frozen account statements, and finally at the coward Derek, who was still trying to disappear into the shadows of the corner. The silence was absolute, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of a building that had just had its support beams kicked out. I sat at the head of the table, my hands resting flat on the white linen. I felt a strange sense of exhaustion, but it was balanced by the cold satisfaction of seeing the truth finally take up all the space in the room. The heavy mahogany doors did not just open, they were pushed aside with the quiet and efficient authority of people who were paid to handle problems. Two men in crisp white security uniforms stepped into the room. They were followed by a man in a sharp, dark suit who wore a badge identifying him as the guest relations manager. His name was Mr. Henderson. Todd had spent the last hour on his encrypted laptop sending precise digital alerts to the ship internal security and accounting departments. He had provided them with the bank fraud reports, the stolen credit card notifications, and the evidence that the primary funding for the owner suite had been obtained through criminal identity theft. Mr. Henderson did not look at the broken glass on the floor or the tear-stained face of my wife. He looked directly at Cynthia with a gaze that was as cold and hard as a block of ice. He spoke in a low, professional voice that carried the weight of the entire cruise line. He informed Cynthia that the credit card on file for her account had been officially declined and flagged for fraudulent activity. He stated that because the $15,000 balance for the luxury suite had not been settled, and because there was an additional $5,000 in casino debts and boutique charges, the ship was taking immediate action to protect its interests. Cynthia tried to stand up, her shimmering designer gown rustling loudly in the quiet room. She tried to find her old voice, the one she used to manipulate the church deacons and the bank tellers back home. She told Mr. Henderson that there had been a terrible misunderstanding. She claimed that her husband was a wealthy man and that the money was simply being transferred between accounts. She reached for her leather purse, her hands shaking as she pulled out the black credit card I had canceled only hours before. She begged him to run it again, promising him that it would work this time. Mr. Henderson did not even take the card from her hand. He told her that the card had already been flagged by the federal authorities and that any further attempt to use it would be considered a new act of wire fraud under maritime law. He then delivered the final blow to her towering pride. He told her that she and her companion were being officially evicted from the owner's suite effective immediately. He stated that their personal belongings were already being removed by the housekeeping staff and would be held in a secure storage locker until the $20,000 debt to the ship was settled in full. Derek let out a soft, pathetic whine from the corner. He stood up, his hands raised in a gesture of total surrender. He looked at Mr. Henderson and then at the security guards, begging them to listen. He claimed that he was just a guest and that he had no idea where the money was coming from. He tried to distance himself from Cynthia, once again calling her a crazy woman who had lied to him about her wealth. He was a rat, trying to jump off a sinking ship, but the ocean was vast and there was nowhere for him to run. Mr. Henderson informed them that because the ship was currently at maximum capacity and there were no other commercial cabins available, they were being moved to a specialized holding area on the lowest deck. It was a windowless crew-adjacent cabin usually reserved for emergency staff overflows or guests under administrative investigation. It was located deep in the belly of the ship near the laundry facilities and the secondary engine rooms. He told them their room keys would be restricted to this new cabin only and that all their charging privileges had been permanently revoked. They were essentially being placed under house arrest on a floating steel island. I watched as the security guards stepped forward and gripped Derek by his arms. They didn't use handcuffs, but their grip was firm and uncompromising. They turned toward Cynthia and waited for her to move. She looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with a desperate, pleading light. She was looking for the Wallace who used to fix every problem and forgive every sin. But that man had been incinerated in the fire of her betrayal. I simply nodded to Mr. Henderson and watched as they led the two of them out of the mahogany dining room. The walk of shame was a long and agonizing journey for Cynthia. They were led through the main promenade where the evening crowds were just beginning to gather for the late-night shows. People stopped and stared at the beautiful woman in the shimmering dress and the handsome man in the tuxedo being escorted by 3 security officers. The whispers followed them like a cold wind. Cynthia kept her head down, her face hidden behind her hair, but she couldn't hide the absolute humiliation of her fall. They were taken to the service elevators, the ones used for trash removal and luggage transport. They were taken down deck after deck, leaving behind the smell of expensive flowers and the sound of violins. They finally reached the lowest level of the ship. The air down here was different. It was heavy and hot, smelling of industrial detergent and diesel fuel. It was the world I had lived in for 40 years, and now it was my wife's new home. They were pushed into a tiny, cramped cabin with 2 narrow metal bunks and a single flickering fluorescent light. There was no window to see the ocean. There was no balcony to breathe the fresh air. There was only the constant rhythmic thudding of the massive engines vibrating through the steel walls. Security locked the door from the outside and informed them that they were only allowed to leave for scheduled meal times at the crew buffet. For the next 3 days, Cynthia lived in a waking nightmare. The woman who had spent 40 years believing she was superior to everyone around her was now a prisoner on the very ship where she had planned to reign as a queen. Every morning she was escorted by a junior staff member to the back of the massive buffet hall. She had to stand in line with the workers and the budget travelers, her designer dress becoming wrinkled and stained because she had no access to her luggage or a laundry service. The most brutal part of her punishment was the silence. On the 3rd day she spotted Matilda and the rest of the family sitting at a large circular table near the window. They were laughing and sharing a beautiful breakfast overlooking the blue Caribbean waters. Cynthia broke away from her escort and ran toward the table, her eyes wild with a frantic hope. She fell to her knees beside her mother's chair and began to beg for a piece of bread or a kind word. She grabbed at Thomas' arm, crying that she was starving and cold in the lower decks. I watched from a distant table as the family reacted. It was the most perfect and coordinated display of discipline I had ever seen. Thomas did not look down. Martha did not stop her conversation. Matilda continued to sip her tea, her eyes fixed firmly on the horizon. They acted as if Cynthia were a ghost, as if she did not exist in their physical world. They were a solid wall of silence and judgment. When the security guard finally caught up to her and pulled her away, the family didn't even flinch. They had officially wiped her from their history. As for Derek, he proved to be exactly the man I knew him to be. The moment they were locked in that tiny cabin, he stopped speaking to Cynthia entirely. He spent his hours pacing the small space like a caged predator. When they were allowed out for meals, he didn't sit with her. He used the last of his fake charm to flirt with the young female bartenders at the back of the ship, trying to convince them to give him free drinks or a way off the vessel. He would lean over the bar, his tuxedo jacket wrinkled and dirty, whispering lies to any woman who would listen, while Cynthia sat alone in the corner with a tray of cold food. Cynthia sat there, watching the man she had destroyed her life for try to replace her before the ship even reached the next port. She was realizing that her great romance was nothing more than a cheap transaction that had finally gone bankrupt. She was trapped in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by thousands of people, but she had never been more alone in her entire life. She was a prisoner of her own greed, and the engine noise of the ship was the only thing that would listen to her cry. The silent adjustment had reached its peak, and there was nowhere left for her to go but down. The massive engines of the cruise ship finally let out a low, deep rumble that vibrated through the steel floor beneath my boots as the vessel slowly glided into the port of Miami. I stood on the private observation deck for first-class passengers, watching the bright Florida sun rise over the glass towers of the city. The ocean was calm, and the sky was a brilliant shade of blue, but the world I had known for 40 years was gone. I spent the last 3 days watching the horizon and feeling the weight of the finality of my decisions. Beside me, Todd and Keisha stood in silence. We were a solid unit now, a small fortress of loyalty that had survived the storm of betrayal. We had our priority disembarkation passes in our hands, which meant we would be the first people to step off this floating palace and back onto solid ground. I thought about Cynthia down in the dark, windowless belly of the ship. She had spent the final 72 hours of the trip in a cramped metal room smelling of industrial soap and hearing the constant thudding of the machinery. She had been stripped of her luxury and her pride and her family. She was no longer the queen of the church choir or the sophisticated traveler. She was just a woman who owed a massive corporation $20,000 with no way to pay it. I felt no joy in her suffering, but I felt the cold peace of a job properly finished. I was a marine engineer, and I knew that when a ship is structurally compromised beyond repair, you do not try to patch the holes while you are in the middle of the deep water. You save the passengers who matter, and you let the wreckage sink to the bottom. The announcement for priority disembarkation echoed through the high-end lounges. We walked toward the main exit through the wide, carpeted hallways lined with gold trim and expensive art. The staff members bowed and smiled at us as we passed. They saw a wealthy, retired man traveling with his successful daughter and his professional son-in-law. They saw the image of a perfect, successful family. They had no idea that we were the ones who had just executed a surgical strike against a traitor. We walked down the glass-enclosed gangway and felt the sudden shift in the air as we moved from the recycled ship atmosphere to the humid, salty heat of Miami. The terminal was a chaotic hive of activity. Thousands of people were rushing back and forth, dragging heavy suitcases and searching for their rides. But the first-class exit was quiet and orderly. We moved through the customs line in minutes, our passports being stamped with the mechanical rhythm of bureaucracy. As we walked out of the terminal doors and onto the crowded concrete curb, I felt the solid earth beneath my feet. I was back in the world where laws mattered, and where forged signatures carried the weight of prison sentences. We stood near the designated pickup zone where the expensive private car services were waiting. Todd had already arranged for his large black sport utility vehicle to be delivered to the port. We stood there for a few minutes, waiting for the valet to bring the truck around. That was when I saw her. Cynthia was standing about 50 feet away near the back of the general passenger exit. She looked like a ghost of the woman who had walked onto the ship 5 days ago. Her shimmering designer gown was wrinkled and stained at the hem from the dirty floors of the crew buffet. Her perfectly styled hair was a matted mess, and her eyes were red and swollen from days of constant crying. She was clutching the handles of her heavy leather suitcases, the ones she had packed with such arrogant joy in our bedroom back in Atlanta. Beside her, Derek was nowhere to be seen. The professional scammer had clearly abandoned her the moment the ship hit the dock, disappearing into the crowd to find his next victim or to run from the federal agents he knew were coming for him. Cynthia was alone. She was standing in the middle of the crowded terminal with her expensive luggage and her broken spirit. She looked around frantically, her gaze darting from face to face, searching for someone who would recognize her. She looked like a child who had been lost in a grocery store. When her eyes finally landed on us, standing near the first-class curb, her entire body seemed to convulse with a sudden desperate hope. She dropped the handles of her bags and began to run toward us, her heels clicking unevenly on the concrete. She reached us just as the valet pulled Todd's massive black vehicle to the curb. She didn't look at Keisha or Todd. She threw herself directly at me, her hands grabbing at the sleeves of my jacket. She was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe, her voice a broken and high-pitched wail. She begged me to listen. She screamed that she was sorry and that she had learned her lesson. She told me that the last 3 days were a living hell and that she realized I was the only man who ever truly loved her. She told me she was ready to go home and start over. She promised she would spend every single day of the rest of her life making it up to me if I would just take her back to Atlanta. I stood perfectly still as she clung to my arms. I felt the heat of her tears soaking through the fabric of my suit, but I felt absolutely nothing inside my chest. It was like watching a performance in a language I no longer understood. Keisha stepped forward, her face a mask of pure and absolute disgust. She told her mother to get her hands off me. Keisha's voice was cold and sharp, telling Cynthia that she had lost the right to touch me the moment she stole the money meant for her grandchildren. Cynthia ignored her daughter and kept her focus entirely on me. She begged me for a ride home. She said she didn't have any money for a taxi or a flight. She said the ship had taken her passport and her jewelry as collateral for the debt. She was begging for mercy from the very man she had tried to leave destitute. Todd opened the heavy rear door of the SUV and helped Keisha into the back seat. He then walked around to the driver's side and climbed in, starting the powerful engine. The low rumble of the truck filled the air. I slowly reached down and detached Cynthia's fingers from my jacket sleeves. My movements were calm and deliberate. I didn't push her away and I didn't raise my voice. I simply stepped back and climbed into the passenger seat. Cynthia followed me to the door, her hands scratching at the window glass as I closed it. She was screaming my name, her face pressed against the tinted window like a nightmare. She was begging for a ride. She was begging for her house. She was begging for her life back. I reached out and pressed the button to roll down the electronic window. The humid Miami air rushed into the cool interior of the truck. Cynthia stopped screaming for a second, her eyes wide with hope, thinking that I was finally going to give in and let her inside. She leaned in toward the opening, her breath smelling of cheap ship coffee and desperation. I looked her directly in the eye for the final time. I spoke in a low, heavy rumble that was perfectly steady. I told her very clearly that she had no home to go back to Cynthia. I explained that the house was now legally owned by the trust, and that she had been officially barred from the property. I told her that she had forged a mortgage and committed bank fraud, and that the local authorities in Atlanta had already been fully briefed on her crimes. Then I delivered the final absolute truth. I told her that Todd had made a phone call to the local police department 5 minutes ago. I told her that there were 2 officers currently standing inside the terminal waiting for her to try and leave the port area. Cynthia's face went completely blank. The realization of the finality of her situation hit her with the force of a hammer. She wasn't just losing her husband and her family. She was losing her freedom. She looked behind her toward the terminal doors and saw 2 men in uniform walking slowly toward the curb. Her hands fell away from the door of the truck. I looked at her one last time and I told her that the silent adjustment was officially over. I told her that she had spent 40 years being protected by my strength, and today she was finally going to find out what happens when that protection is gone. I pressed the button and watched the thick glass window slide back up, sealing her out of my life forever. Todd put the heavy vehicle into gear and pulled away from the curb. I didn't look back in the side mirror. I didn't need to see the police officers putting the handcuffs on her wrists or her falling to the sidewalk in a heap of wrinkled designer silk. I looked straight ahead at the open highway leading us back to a life of truth and dignity. She was standing on the curb in Miami with nothing but her lies and her debt while we were driving toward a future that she could no longer touch. The structure had been demolished, and the site was finally clear for something new. Todd accelerated onto the main road, and the port faded away behind us, leaving Cynthia alone with the consequences of her own greed. The drive back from Miami was the quietest and most peaceful journey of my entire life. I sat in the passenger seat of Todd's vehicle, watching the Florida coastline disappear behind us while the rhythmic hum of the highway acted as a soothing balm for my soul. My daughter Keisha sat in the back, her head resting against the window, finally asleep, after days of high-intensity stress. We did not talk much because there was nothing left to say. Every calculation had been made, every valve had been adjusted, and the structural integrity of our family had been restored through a necessary and brutal demolition. When we finally pulled into our suburban driveway in Atlanta, the house looked exactly the same as it did the morning Cynthia left. The manicured lawn was green and the white paint on the porch was pristine, but the spirit of the home had been completely transformed. It was no longer a place of hidden lies and secret betrayals. It was a fortress of truth. The news of Cynthia's arrest hit our local community like a lightning strike. Because she was such a prominent figure in the church, the gossip spread through the neighborhood faster than a summer storm. But there were no voices rising up to defend her. Todd had been incredibly thorough in his digital reporting. The evidence of the forged mortgage was undeniable. The bank's fraud investigators had a mountain of paperwork showing exactly how she had stolen my identity to fund her illicit romance. I was told that when the Miami police processed her at the terminal, she did not even fight them. She just sat on the cold metal bench staring at her stained designer dress as if she were seeing her reflection in a broken mirror for the first time. She was formally charged with multiple counts of grand theft, bank fraud, and identity theft. Because the amount was so high and the evidence was so clear, the judge set a massive bail that she had no way of paying. She was trapped in a cell waiting for a trial that would surely end in a long prison sentence. As for Derek, the man who thought he had found the ultimate sugar mama, his exit from the stage was even more pathetic. The Internal Revenue Service agents were waiting for him at the luggage claim. They did not just take his passport, they took everything. They seized the luxury sports car he had bought with my retirement money before he even got a chance to drive it through the city. They traced every single wire transfer and every secret account. It turned out Derek had a long trail of victims behind him across 3 different states, but this time he had finally run into a wall he could not charm his way over. He was facing years in federal prison for tax evasion and conspiracy to commit fraud. I heard through Todd that Derek tried to cut a deal by offering to testify against Cynthia, but the prosecutors did not need his testimony. They had the numbers, and the numbers never lie. He was going to spend his middle age in a gray concrete room with nothing but the memory of a cruise he could not afford. The most powerful part of the aftermath was the silence from Cynthia's family. Matilda, the fierce 92-year-old matriarch, held a private meeting at her home the Sunday after we returned. She invited her brothers and sisters and the church elders. She stood before them and officially declared that Cynthia was no longer a part of their bloodline. She told them that the daughter they knew had died the moment she betrayed a righteous man like Wallace. There were no tears and no excuses. The family completely wiped her name from their records. When Cynthia's lawyer tried to contact Thomas to ask for bail money, Thomas simply hung up the phone without saying a word. They had disowned her with the same cold precision I used to cut a rusted engine part out of a ship. She was an infection that had been surgically removed to save the rest of the body. A week after our return, Keisha and Todd moved into the house. It was a decision we made together around the kitchen table. The house was now legally Keisha's through the trust, and she wanted to make sure I was never alone again. They brought their 2 young children, my beautiful grandchildren, into the home. The silence that Cynthia had used as a weapon was replaced by the chaotic and joyful sound of children running down the hallway and the smell of fresh cooking in the kitchen. We repainted the master bedroom and replaced the furniture, stripping away every single physical reminder of the woman who had tried to leave me destitute. Every time I heard my grandson's laughter echoing through the living room, I felt a piece of my tired heart begin to heal. I was no longer just a retired engineer. I was a grandfather who had successfully protected his legacy. The house feels different now. I walked through the rooms yesterday and I could not find a single trace of the lie. The wallpaper in the hallway that Cynthia picked out with stolen money has been stripped away. The expensive curtains that hid her secrets have been replaced with light, airy fabric that lets the Georgia sun pour in. It is as if the house itself has taken a deep breath and exhaled 40 years of hidden tension. I look at my daughter, Keisha. She is a nurse who has seen the worst of humanity in her hospital wards. But seeing her own mother try to dismantle our family was a different kind of wound. I watch her in the kitchen now, laughing with Todd as they plan the garden for next spring. She is no longer a victim. She is the owner of her childhood home. She is the guardian of the legacy I spent my life building. That is the true victory. It was not just about the money or the house, it was about ensuring that the truth survived for the next generation. I spent 40 years down in the engine rooms of massive commercial ships. I spent my life breathing in diesel fumes and listening to the rhythmic thumping of heavy pistons. I learned that you cannot ignore a vibration in the hull. You cannot pretend that a leak does not exist just because the ship is still moving forward. My marriage was a ship that had been taking on water for a long time, and I was too tired to see the structural damage. But when the truth finally surfaced, I did not panic. I used my training. I analyzed the failure, I located the source of the corruption, and I cut it out with surgical precision. I did not just survive a betrayal. I engineered a future where my family is safe and the lies can no longer reach us. Now I spend my evenings exactly where I belong. I sit in my heavy wooden chair on the front porch with a mug of strong black coffee in my hand. I watch the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple. I feel the cool evening breeze on my skin, and I listen to the quiet sounds of the neighborhood. I see Todd playing catch with the kids in the yard, and I see Keisha reading a book on the porch swing. This is the ironclad peace I fought for. It is a peace built on the solid foundation of truth and loyalty. Cynthia thought she could leave me with nothing, but she was the one who ended up with an empty life. I am Wallace, and I am still standing. I learned that true strength for a man in his twilight years is not found in volume, but in velocity. Anger makes you scream, but clarity makes you calculate. When the person you spent a lifetime protecting decides to treat you like a decaying asset, you do not beg for their loyalty. You simply change the locks on reality. I didn't ruin Cynthia's life. I merely provided the stage for her to ruin her own. Peace is not given freely in this world. Sometimes you have to financially and legally architect it. Trust the numbers, never trust the fake tears. If you found strength in my story today, please like and subscribe to the channel for more accounts of resilience and justice. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had to make a difficult choice to protect your own peace. Your support helps me keep sharing these truths with the world. Thank you for listening.